The two graves sat side by side in the shadow of an old oak, one large and one small, both marked with simple wooden crosses weathered by seasons of sun and rain. Mason Tolliver knelt before them, his frame as weathered as the crosses themselves, placing two prairie wildflowers, one blue, one yellow, at their bases. The morning light cut across the small clearing, painting long shadows behind him. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice rough like stone against leather. "Sorry, Emma." His calloused fingers brushed the smaller cross. "Pa didn't keep his promise." The prairie wind whispered through the tall grass surrounding the private cemetery, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Mason's shoulders, once squared with the confidence of a lawman, now slumped with the weight of memories that refused to fade. 3 years had passed, yet the weight hadn't lightened. If anything, it had settled deeper into his bones. His fingers reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small, worn Bible. The spine cracked as he opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit." He read aloud the words, carried away by the wind. He closed the book, his jaw tightening. But sometimes Lord close ain't enough. The sudden crack of a gunshot shattered the stillness, echoing across the open land. Mason's head snapped up, his body tensing like a bowstring. His hand instinctively dropped to the revolver at his hip, years of training, surfacing through layers of grief. The sound had come from the direction of the abandoned train station, maybe 2 miles east. Another shot followed, then a third. Mason rose to his feet, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Then, carried on, the wind came something that froze his blood, the high, terrified scream of a child. Without conscious thought, Mason was running toward his horse, tethered nearby. The chestnut mare snorted and stamped as he swung into the saddle, and then they were moving hooves thundering across the hard-packed earth. "Yeah!" he urged, leaning low over the horse's neck as they galloped over the rolling terrain. The forgotten Bible lay in the dust behind him. The abandoned Clearwater station had been dead for nearly 2 decades, its wooden platform warped and splitting, its ticket office collapsing in on itself like a wounded animal. The railway had moved 10 miles south when the new line was built, leaving this place to the mercy of time and weather. Mason slowed his approach as the station came into view, drawing his revolver. The silence now was as complete as the gunshots had been jarring. He dismounted 100 yards out, tethering his horse to a scrub oak, and proceeded on foot, moving with the careful precision of a man who had spent years tracking those who didn't want to be found. The platform came into view. Mason's breath caught in his throat. 2 small figures were tied to the station's support posts, pale arms pulled behind them, rope cutting into soft skin. 2 little girls, one perhaps 7, the other no more than 5. The older stood straight, despite her bonds, chin raised in defiance, eyes wide and alert. The younger pressed her face against the weathered wood, silent tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Beside them, a woman lay sprawled on the platform, unmoving. Blood matted her dark hair where it spread across the warped boards. 20 feet away lay the body of a man, face down, a dark stain spreading beneath him. Mason stepped onto the platform, his footfalls heavy against the wood. The older girl's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. There was no fear in that gaze, only a wary calculation that no child should possess. "Mama's dying," she said, her voice small but steady. "Can you save her?" Something in those eyes struck Mason like a physical blow. He'd seen that look before in Emma's eyes the day he'd taught her to ride. Determination mixed with a child's absolute faith that her father could fix anything. "I'll try," he said, holstering his weapon and kneeling beside the woman. He pressed his fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow. What happened here? Bad on bad men, the younger girl whispered finally, lifting her head. They hurt Mama. Mason moved to the children, drawing his knife. The older girl flinched, but held her ground as he cut through the ropes, binding her wrists. What's your name? He asked. Hannah, she replied immediately, rubbing her chafed wrists. That's Grace, she nodded toward her sister. I'm Mason, Mason Tolliver. He cut Grace free next, noting the way the little girl immediately clung to her sister. You girls hurt. Hannah shook her head. Just Mama. Mason moved to check the dead man, approaching cautiously, though it was clear he posed no threat. The man was dressed in dusty trail clothes, a six-shooter still in its holster. Mason turned him over, revealing a face he didn't recognize, unshaven, weathered by sun and hard living. But what caught his eye was the tattoo visible at the collar of the man's shirt, a coiled rattlesnake, its tail raised to strike. A cold feeling settled in Mason's gut. The Rattler Gang. They'd been terrorizing the territory for years, known for their brutality, and the trail of bodies they left in their wake. He searched the man's pockets, finding nothing but a handful of bullets, a small knife, and some tobacco. Then he noticed something protruding from the man's vest, the edge of a badge hidden inside. Mason pulled it free, studying the star. A deputy's badge from Redemption County, 2 territories over. Was he a lawman? Hannah asked suddenly at his elbow. Mason shook his head slowly. Not a real one. He tucked the badge into his own pocket. A man wearing something that doesn't belong to him. He returned to the girls, kneeling to their level. I need to get your mama somewhere safe. My ranch is about 2 miles from here. Can you ride? Hannah nodded. Pa taught us. But good girl. Mason glanced at the woman, calculating. I'm going to carry your mama to my horse. You two wait here. As he gathered the unconscious woman in his arms, he noted how light she was, as if grief had already hollowed her out. Her face, despite the dirt and blood, held a gentle beauty that reminded him painfully of Sarah. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. When he returned to the girls, Hannah was holding a small piece of paper, her expression confused. What's that? Mason asked. It was in my pocket, she said, holding it out. I didn't put it there. Mason shifted the woman's weight to take the paper. The message was written in a cramped, hurried hand. To Mason Tolliver. It's your daughter. Save them. There was no signature. Mason stared at the note, blood roaring in his ears. His daughter Emma was dead, buried beneath that small wooden cross on his land. Yet the words on the paper burned into his vision like a brand. Mr. Grace's small voice pulled him back. Is Mama gonna die? Mason folded the paper and tucked it away, his mind racing. No, little one, not today. He helped the girls onto his horse, placing Grace in front of the saddle and Hannah behind, then mounted himself, cradling the unconscious woman against his chest. As they rode away, Mason couldn't help glancing back at the body they were leaving behind. Who was he? What did the note mean? And why had the Rattlers, if that's who they were, left the girls alive? Mason's ranch sat in a small valley protected on 3 sides by gently sloping hills. It wasn't much a modest cabin, with a barn behind it, a corral for the horses, and a small vegetable garden that had seen better days. But it was his, paid for, with years of wearing a badge and keeping the peace in towns that sometimes seemed determined to tear themselves apart. He carried the woman into the cabin, laying her gently on his bed. The sheets would be stained with blood and dirt, but that hardly mattered now. Hannah, fetch water from the pump outside, he instructed. Grace, can you find me some clean cloths? In that trunk by the wall. The girls moved with the efficiency of children accustomed to helping, while Mason examined the woman's wounds. A deep gash at her temple was the source of most of the blood, but there were bruises forming on her arms and face, telling a story of struggle. Nothing appeared broken, though a small mercy. He cleaned the wound carefully, the way he'd learned during the war, when doctors were scarce, and men had to tend their own. The woman Abigail Hannah had called her moaned softly, but didn't wake. Will she be okay? Hannah asked, standing at his elbow, her eyes fixed on her mother's face. I believe so, Mason replied. Head wounds bleed something fierce, but her breathing's steady. She needs rest now. Hannah nodded, her small shoulders slumping slightly, the first sign of relief she'd shown. Grace had curled up in a chair nearby, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Neither child had shed tears since they'd arrived, a fact that troubled Mason more than if they'd been hysterical. When did you last eat? He asked, realizing they might have been at that station for hours. Hannah shrugged. Yesterday, I think. We had some jerky. Mason nodded, moving to the small stove in the corner of the one-room cabin. I'll fix something. Why don't you two rest? As he set water to boil for cornmeal mush, the quickest meal he could prepare, Mason's mind returned to the note. It's your daughter. What did that mean? He glanced at Hannah, studying her features. She had dark hair like her mother, a serious face, eyes that seemed to take in everything. Nothing about her reminded him of Emma, with her blonde curls and sunny smile. Yet, there was something in the way she carried herself, in the determined set of her jaw. Mason shook his head. The note was a mistake, or worse, some kind of trap. His daughter was dead, buried on the hill behind this very cabin. He'd held her broken body in his arms, had lowered her into the ground himself. There was no mistaking that kind of grief. Once the food was ready, he roused the girls. They ate in silence, both too tired for conversation. When they finished, Mason made a pallet for them near the fire, using blankets from his trunk. Get some sleep, he told them. I'll keep watch over your mama. Grace was asleep almost before she lay down, but Hannah lingered, her eyes finding Mason's. Thank you, she said, her voice small in the quiet cabin. For saving us. Mason nodded, something tight constricting his chest. Sleep now, child. As the girls slept, Mason sat by Abigail's bedside, studying her face. Who was she? How had she ended up at that abandoned station, and what connection did she have to the Rattler gang? The questions circled in his mind like buzzards, offering no answers. He reached into his pocket, drawing out the mysterious note again. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message impossible. Yet someone had known his name, had known where to leave these people for him to find. Outside, the day was fading, shadows lengthening across the floor of the cabin. Mason checked his revolver, making sure it was loaded, then placed it on the table beside the bed. Whatever was happening, he wouldn't be caught unprepared again. Not like the day he'd lost Sarah and Emma. The nightmares came as they always did, dragging him back to that day 3 years ago. The urgent message from his deputy. A bank robbery in progress 2 towns over. His decision to ride out, leaving Sarah and Emma alone at the ranch. The long ride back, pushing his horse to exhaustion, a plume of black smoke visible from miles away. The cabin in flames, the barn already collapsed. No sign of his wife or daughter. Digging through the smoldering ruins with bare hands, ignoring the burns, searching desperately for survivors. Finding them in the root cellar, where they'd tried to hide. Sarah's body curved protectively around Emma's, both of them still and silent from the smoke that had seeped through the floorboards. Mason jerked awake, a cold sweat covering his body. The cabin was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. The girls still slept on their pallet. Grace curled against Hannah's side. Abigail hadn't moved. He rose silently, stepping outside to clear his head. The night air was cool against his skin, the stars brilliant in the clear sky. In the distance, a coyote called a lonely sound that seemed to echo his own isolation. "I couldn't save them," he whispered to the night, "and I was the one sworn to protect them." After Sarah and Emma's deaths, Mason had resigned his position as sheriff. He couldn't bear to wear the badge anymore, not when it had cost him everything he loved. He'd retreated to this ranch, existing rather than living, keeping his promise to visit their graves each Sunday, but otherwise avoiding anything that might reopen wounds that had never truly healed. Now somehow he'd been pulled back into someone else's tragedy. Those little girls, that wounded woman, they needed protection. And despite everything, despite his failure, he was still a man who couldn't turn away from those in need. Mason returned to the cabin, checking on his unexpected guests, before settling into a chair by the door, his revolver across his lap. He would keep watch until morning. It was the least he could do. Dawn broke with the soft glow of pink and gold spreading across the eastern sky. Mason, who had dozed fitfully in his chair, was awakened by movement from the bed. Abigail was stirring, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness returned. He moved to her side, ready to calm her if she panicked upon waking in a strange place. Her eyes opened deep brown, clouded with confusion and pain. "Easy," Mason said quietly. "You're safe." Her gaze darted around the cabin, alarm growing until she spotted the girls asleep by the fire. The tension in her body eased slightly, but wariness remained in her eyes as they returned to Mason. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Mason Tolliver. I found you and your daughters at Clearwater Station. You were hurt." She raised a hand to the bandage at her temple, wincing. "The girls, they're not hurt?" "No, ma'am," scared and hungry, but unharmed. Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by caution. "The man, dead when I arrived," Mason replied, rattler tattoo on his neck. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition and fear. "There will be others," she said, her voice barely audible. "Why were you at that station?" Mason asked. "It's been abandoned for years." Abigail's gaze slid away. "We needed somewhere to rest. We've been traveling for days." The evasion was clear, but Mason didn't press. She was still weak, and he had no right to demand answers. Still, if the Rattler gang was involved, the danger wasn't past. "You should rest more," he said, rising from the bedside. "I'll fix something to eat when the girls wake." As he moved toward the stove, Hannah sat up on the pallet, instantly alert. Her eyes found her mother, and in a flash she was at the bedside, small hands reaching for Abigail's. "Mama," she breathed, relief clear in her voice. "You're awake." "I'm here, sweet girl," Abigail assured her, squeezing Hannah's hands. "We're safe for now." Grace stirred next, rubbing her eyes with tiny fists before noticing her mother. A smile broke across her face, the first real joy Mason had seen from either child. "Mama!" she cried, scrambling to join her sister at the bedside. Abigail embraced both girls, tears sliding down her cheeks. Mason turned away, giving them privacy in their reunion, a sharp ache in his chest. Once he'd known that kind of love, the fierce protective bond of family. Now all he had were memories and 2 wooden crosses on a hillside. He busied himself preparing breakfast coffee for himself and Abigail, milk for the girls, and cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of his molasses. The domestic sounds of a family behind him were both comforting and painful, a reminder of everything he'd lost. When the food was ready, he set it on the small table, then helped Abigail sit up, propping pillows behind her back. The girls ate hungrily, and even Abigail managed a few bites, though pain still lined her face. "Thank you," she said quietly when the meal was done. "For all of this, we won't impose on your kindness long." Mason shook his head. "You're in no condition to travel, ma'am, and if the rattlers are after you, you'll need more than luck to stay ahead of them." Abigail's eyes hardened. "We've managed this far." "And nearly died at that station," Mason replied, his voice gentle but firm. "At least stay until you're stronger. Then we can talk about what comes next." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions in his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "A few days," she conceded. "No more." Mason nodded, accepting her terms. "I need to tend to the animals. Hannah, Grace, would you like to help?" Grace nodded eagerly, but Hannah looked to her mother first, seeking permission. Abigail gave a slight nod, and Hannah's shoulders relaxed. "We'll be right outside," Mason assured Abigail. "Rest while you can." Outside, the morning had bloomed into a perfect late spring day, the sky a deep blue vault overhead. Mason led the girls to the small barn where he kept his 2 horses and a milk cow. "Have you ever milked a cow?" he asked Grace, who shook her head, eyes wide. "Would you like to learn?" Her smile was answer enough. Mason showed her how to sit on the small stool, how to grasp the teats and pull with gentle pressure. Her first attempts were clumsy, but she giggled when the milk finally streamed into the bucket. Hannah watched from a few feet away, her arms crossed, stance, guarded. She wasn't ready to let her guard down, and Mason respected that. Trust had to be earned. "Your sister's a natural," he said, nodding toward Grace. "She's good with animals," Hannah replied. "Always has been." Mason nodded, studying the older girl. "And what are you good at, Hannah?" She considered the question seriously. "Taking care of things. Mama says I notice what needs doing." The answer was so adult, so laden with responsibility, that Mason felt a surge of sadness. This child had been forced to grow up too quickly, shouldering burdens no 7-year-old should bear. "That's a fine quality," he said carefully, "but it's also good to remember you're a child. There should be time for play in your life." Hannah's expression remained serious. "Maybe before, not now." Mason didn't press the point. Instead, he showed her how to feed the horses, explaining each step of their care. She absorbed the information with an intensity that reminded him of himself as a boy, eager to learn every aspect of ranch life from his own father. When they returned to the cabin, Abigail was asleep again, her face relaxed in slumber. Mason settled the girls with some paper and pencils he found in an old trunk, then stepped outside to split wood for the stove. The rhythmic swing of the axe helped clear his mind, focusing his thoughts on the immediate task rather than the questions that still swirled. Who had left that note? Why claim one of these girls was his daughter? And what did the Rattler gang want with Abigail and her children? More importantly, what was he going to do about it? The answer came to him that afternoon as he watched Grace chase butterflies in the small meadow beside the cabin. He would protect them. Whatever their story, whatever danger followed them, he would stand between these 3 and harm's way. It was what he would have wanted someone to do for Sarah and Emma had the circumstances been reversed. It was also, he admitted to himself, a chance for redemption. He had failed his family. Perhaps in saving this one, he might find some measure of peace. But first he needed to understand what they were facing, and that meant a visit to town to gather information and supplies. Cedar Ridge was a small settlement, barely more than a wide spot in the trail, but it had a general store and a saloon where gossip flowed as freely as whiskey. When Abigail woke again, looking stronger, Mason explained his plan. "I need to go into town," he said. "We're low on supplies, and I want to hear if there's any news about rattler activity in the area." Wariness returned to her eyes. "Is it safe to leave us here?" "Safer than taking you with me," Mason replied. "No one knows you're here, and the ranch is isolated. Keep the doors locked, and there's a shotgun behind the door if you need it." He showed her the weapon, making sure she knew how to use it. Abigail handled the shotgun with surprising familiarity, checking the loads and sighting down the barrel. "My husband taught me," she said, answering his unspoken question. "He believed a woman should know how to protect herself and her children." Mason nodded, impressed, despite himself. "I'll be back before dark." As he saddled his horse, Hannah appeared at his side, her expression troubled. "Will you really come back?" she asked, her voice small. The question caught him off guard. "Of course I will. This is my home." "People leave," she said simply, "even when they say they won't." Mason knelt to her level, meeting her gaze directly. "Hannah, I give you my word. I will come back. And my word means something, even if you don't know that yet." She studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Finally, she nodded once, accepting his promise. "Take care of your mama and sister while I'm gone," he said, rising. "You're good at taking care of things, remember?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I remember." Cedar Ridge consisted of one main street, with a scattering of buildings, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a cluster of houses. It wasn't much, but it served the surrounding ranches and farms as a supply point and social center. Mason rode in slowly, aware of the curious glances directed his way. He'd been something of a hermit since settling here after leaving his sheriff's position, and his presence in town was noteworthy. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside the bell above the door, announcing his arrival. Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor's wife, looked up from her knitting, surprise evident on her face. "Mason Tolliver," she said, setting aside her work. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." "Mrs. Patterson," he acknowledged with a nod. "Need some supplies?" Of course, of course." She moved behind the counter, ready to fill his order. "What can I get for you?" Mason listed his needs: flour, coffee, sugar, a bolt of cloth for bandages, some children's clothing. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose with each item. "Expecting company, are you?" she asked, her curiosity barely contained. "Just stocking up," Mason replied neutrally. The less the town knew about his guests, the better at least, until he understood what danger they might be in. Mrs. Patterson clearly didn't believe him, but she gathered the items without further comment. As she wrapped the purchases in brown paper, the bell above the door rang again, and Mason turned to see Ezekiel Thompson enter. The old preacher had been a fixture in Cedar Ridge for as long as anyone could remember, his tall, spare frame and shock of white hair as familiar as the church steeple itself. His deep-set eyes brightened at the sight of Mason. "Brother Tolliver," he greeted, his voice resonant despite his age. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing you to town on this very day." Mason nodded politely. He respected the preacher, even if he'd stopped attending services after losing his family. "Reverend Thompson, I was just thinking of riding out to your place," Thompson continued. "Missed you at Sunday service again, and the Lord laid it on my heart to check on you." "I'm fine, Reverend," Mason said, discomfort rising at the prospect of the preacher visiting the ranch. He wasn't ready to explain Abigail and the girls. Thompson studied him with knowing eyes. "The body may be fine, son, but the soul needs tending too, especially after such loss as yours." Mason shifted, eager to change the subject. Any news in town, strangers passing through? The preacher's expression sobered. As a matter of fact, yes. Had some rough-looking men in the saloon last night, not the usual drovers or cowboys. These men had a hardness to them that troubled my spirit. Mason's interest sharpened. Did you hear what they were after? They were asking about a woman and two young girls, Thompson replied. Said the woman had stolen something valuable from their employer. Didn't say who that was, but they wore expensive guns for common bounty hunters. A chill settled in Mason's gut. How many men? 3 that I saw, but they mentioned others would be joining them. The preacher leaned closer. Mason, if you know something about this, be careful. These aren't men who follow the law. I appreciate the warning, Reverend. Mason paid Mrs. Patterson for his purchases, eager now to return to the ranch. Another time, perhaps. As he loaded the supplies onto his horse, Thompson followed him outside. Mason, he said quietly, whatever trouble you may find yourself in, remember that the Good Shepherd leaves the 99 to find the one lost sheep. Sometimes in saving others, we find our own salvation. Mason met the old man's gaze, wondering how much he had guessed. I'll keep that in mind, Reverend. Mounting up, he turned his horse toward home, a new urgency in his movements. The Rattlers were in town looking for Abigail and her daughters. The danger was closer than he'd thought. The ride back to the ranch seemed interminable, though his horse maintained a steady pace. Mason's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. If the Rattlers found Abigail and the girls at his ranch, they would show no mercy to any of them. As he crested the final hill before the valley where his ranch lay, Mason reined in sharply. Something wasn't right. The hackles on the back of his neck rose, a sensation he'd learned to trust during his years wearing a badge. He scanned the approach to his property, carefully looking for signs of intrusion. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but still, the feeling persisted. Then he saw it, a set of hoof prints in the soft earth beside the trail, fresher than his own, from that morning. Someone had ridden this way while he was gone. Mason dismounted, leading his horse off the trail and tethering him in a stand of trees. Drawing his revolver, he approached the ranch on foot, moving quietly through the underbrush. If someone was watching the property, he wanted to see them before they saw him. The cabin appeared undisturbed, smoke rising from the chimney as it should. The barn door was closed, the corral empty except for his second horse. No strangers' mounts were visible. Still, Mason circled the property cautiously, checking for signs of watchers. He found none, which troubled him more than if he had. The fresh hoof prints suggested someone had been here, but they hadn't stayed. Why, when he was satisfied no immediate threat lurked nearby, Mason approached the cabin, calling out before entering so as not to startle its occupants. "It's Mason," he announced, opening the door slowly. Inside, he found Abigail sitting at the table, her face pale but composed. Hannah and Grace sat on the floor nearby, playing some quiet game with sticks and pebbles. "You're back early," Abigail observed, relief evident in her voice despite her attempt to hide it. "Someone's been near the ranch," Mason said without preamble. "Did you see or hear anything while I was gone?" Abigail shook her head. "Nothing. We've been inside as you suggested." Mason set down his supplies, checking that the shotgun remained in its place by the door. There were men in town asking about a woman and two girls. Men with connections to the Rattlers. Fear flashed across Abigail's face before she controlled it. Did they mention names?" "No, but they said the woman stole something valuable from their employer." Mason watched her carefully. "Is that true? Did you take something from them?" Abigail's gaze dropped to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "Not from them. from my husband." "Your husband was a rattler?" Mason asked the pieces, starting to align. "No," she said firmly, looking up again. "Samuel was. He worked for them once, years ago, before we met. But he'd left that life behind." Hannah had gone, still listening intently. Grace continued playing, oblivious to the tension in the room. "They killed him," Hannah said, suddenly, her young voice hard with certainty. "The snake men killed Pa." Abigail reached for her daughter, drawing her close. "Hannah, please, not now." But the girl pulled away. "It's true, and they want to kill us, too. We should tell him, Mama. He saved us." Mason knelt before Hannah, his voice gentle but firm. "Your mother's right, Hannah. She's hurt, and you've all been through a terrible time. There will be time for telling later, when everyone's rested." The girl looked ready to argue, but finally nodded, returning to her sister's side. Mason turned back to Abigail. "Whatever the truth is, those men are looking for you. And they're close. We need to be prepared." As he moved toward the door to retrieve his supplies, Mason noticed something pinned to the outside of the cabin, a folded piece of paper secured with a hunting knife he didn't recognize. Cold dread pooled in his stomach as he pulled the knife free and unfolded the paper. The message was brief and chilling. "Return what was taken by dawn or history repeats itself." J.C. Mason stared at the note, the blood in his veins turning to ice. "History repeats itself." Those 3 words carried a specific threat that only someone who knew about Sarah and Emma would understand. "What is it?" Abigail asked from the doorway, having followed him outside. Mason refolded the paper, tucking it into his pocket. "A warning," he said grimly. "We need to prepare. They know you're here." As dusk settled over the valley, Mason moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking sight lines from the windows, positioning the shotgun and his rifle for easy access, filling buckets with water in case of fire. The memories of flames consuming his home, his family drove him to exhaustive preparation. Abigail watched from the table, her strength gradually returning. "You've done this before," she observed. Mason paused, a box of ammunition in his hands. "I was a sheriff before, in Montana Territory." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "That explains a lot." "Does it?" Mason returned to his task, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "The way you handled yourself, the way you assessed our injuries, secured the area." She studied him. "Why did you leave?" The question struck too close to wounds still raw. "That's not a story for tonight," he said shortly. Abigail nodded, accepting the boundary. "I'm sorry. You've shown us nothing but kindness, and I've given you nothing but trouble and secrecy in return." Mason softened slightly. "You've been through something terrible. Trust takes time." "Yes," she agreed, a sad smile touching her lips. "But sometimes time is a luxury we don't have." Before Mason could respond, Hannah approached her face serious. "Can I help?" she asked, looking at the preparations Mason was making. He considered the child, struck again by her composure. "Yes, you can. I want to teach you a signal in case there's trouble." Hannah nodded solemnly. "Like this," Mason demonstrated a low, 2-toned whistle. "It carries farther than a shout and won't give away your position." "Can you try?" Hannah attempted the whistle, getting it right on the 3rd try. Mason nodded his approval. "Good. If you see strangers or if you're scared and need help, use that signal. I'll hear it and I'll come." "What if you're too far away?" Hannah asked the practical question, revealing her constant calculation of worst-case scenarios. "Then run to the old oak behind the barn. There's a hollow space in the trunk big enough for you and Grace to hide in. Stay there until I come for you." Hannah absorbed the instructions with grave attention. "I'll show Grace," she said. As the girl moved away, Mason turned back to Abigail. "She's had to grow up too fast." "Yes," Abigail agreed softly. "After Samuel, after we lost him, she took on so much responsibility. Trying to be strong for Grace, for me. She reminds me of someone," Mason said, the words escaping before he could catch them. Abigail's gaze was knowing. "Your daughter," Mason stiffened. "What do you know about my daughter?" "Nothing," Abigail replied, confusion evident in her tone. "I only assumed from the way you look at Hannah sometimes that you might have had a child of your own." Mason relaxed slightly, realizing she wasn't referring to the mysterious note. "I did. Emma. She was 6 when I lost her. Her and my wife, Sarah." "I'm sorry," Abigail said, genuine compassion in her voice. "How long ago?" 3 years. Abigail nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The pain never really leaves, does it? It just becomes a part of you, like breathing." Mason looked at her with newfound respect. Here was someone who understood grief in the way only those who have walked through its valley can. "No, it doesn't leave," he agreed. "But sometimes it eases enough that you can remember the good moments without being crushed by the loss." "I hope to reach that point someday," Abigail said quietly. Before Mason could respond, Grace appeared beside him, holding out a small, carved wooden horse. "For you," she said shyly. "I found it under the bed." Mason took the small toy, recognition washing over him. It had been Emma's, a gift he'd carved for her 5th birthday. How it had ended up under the bed instead of lost in the fire, he couldn't say. "Thank you, Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This was my daughter's. She would have been happy for you to have it." "Where is she?" Grace asked innocently, looking around as if Emma might appear. "She's in heaven," Mason replied, the familiar words coming automatically. "With her mother and the angels." Grace considered this seriously. "My pa's in heaven too. Mama says he watches over us." "I'm sure he does," Mason said, surprised by the depth of emotion this simple conversation stirred in him. He glanced at Abigail, expecting to see sadness, but instead found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, something between curiosity and an emotion deeper than mere gratitude. The moment was broken by a sound outside, the distant whinny of a horse. Mason was instantly alert, moving to the window with the stealth of a man accustomed to danger. "Stay back," he warned, peering into the gathering darkness. A shadow moved along the ridge above the ranch, the silhouette of a rider against the last light of day. The figure remained for a long moment watching, then turned and disappeared beyond the hill. "They're watching us," Abigail whispered, having joined him at the window despite his warning. "Yes," Mason agreed grimly, "making sure we know they're out there." "What do we do?" Mason turned to her, his decision made. "We prepare, and when they come, and they will come, we'll be ready." The look they exchanged held a mutual understanding. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. For Mason, it was a silent vow to protect this family as he had failed to protect his own. For Abigail, it seemed to be a cautious acceptance that perhaps, in this weathered, solitary man, she had found an unexpected ally in her darkest hour. Outside, night settled fully over the valley, bringing with it a heavy silence broken only by the occasional call of a night bird. Somewhere beyond the hills, men with the mark of the rattlesnake waited, planning their approach. But within the cabin's walls, a fragile sense of safety held, maintained by Mason's vigilance and Abigail's quiet strength. For tonight at least, they were safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Mason dreamed of Emma that night, not as she had been in death, but as she had been in life, laughing, running through the tall grass, calling for him to chase her. In the dream, he ran after her, but no matter how fast he moved, she remained just beyond his reach, her voice fading as she disappeared into a stand of trees. "Emma!" he called after her. "Emma, wait!" "She can't hear you," said a voice behind him. Mason turned to find a man standing there, his face in shadow. "But she's not lost, Mason. Not really." "Who are you?" Mason demanded. The man stepped forward, his features resolving into those of someone Mason had known long ago. Simon Reeves, a deputy he'd worked with in Montana, killed in the same raid that had taken Sarah and Emma. "You need to look closer," Simon said, his voice urgent. "The answers are right in front of you, if you'd only see them." "What answers? What are you talking about?" Simon's form began to fade. "The girls, Mason. Look at the girls." Mason jerked awake, the dream dissolving into the gray light of pre-dawn. He was sitting in a chair by the door, his rifle across his lap. He'd insisted on keeping watch through the night, allowing Abigail and the girls to take the bed. The cabin was quiet, the fire in the stove reduced to embers. Mason rose stiffly, stretching muscles cramped from the uncomfortable position. The dream lingered in his mind, Simon's cryptic words echoing. "Look at the girls," moving quietly to avoid waking his guests. Mason peered at the sleeping figures on his bed. Grace lay curled against her mother's side, one small hand fisted in Abigail's dress. Hannah slept on the edge, her back to them, as if even in sleep she maintained her watchful stance. What was he supposed to see? Grace, with her innocent trust and easy affection, reminded him of Emma in some ways, but there was no real resemblance. Hannah, serious and watchful, was nothing like his sunny daughter. Yet there was something about them both that tugged at him, a sense of familiarity he couldn't place. Perhaps it was simply that they awakened his dormant paternal instincts, reminding him of what it felt like to protect someone smaller and more vulnerable than himself. The note in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. "It's your daughter." A cruel joke, or a mystery he wasn't yet equipped to understand. Mason shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. There were more immediate concerns. The Rattlers would be coming, and soon. The warning note had made that clear. He stoked the fire in the stove, setting coffee to boil. The familiar routine helped ground him, pushing away the lingering disquiet from the dream. Abigail stirred first, her eyes opening to find Mason at the stove. "You didn't sleep?" She observed, her voice hushed to avoid waking the girls. "I dozed," he replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Here, it's strong." She accepted the cup gratefully, sitting up carefully to avoid disturbing Grace. No sign of them in the night. Mason shook his head. "Not yet, but they're out there." Abigail sipped the coffee, her expression thoughtful. "Mason, there's something I need to tell you about why they're hunting us." He waited silently, giving her space to find the words. "Samuel, my husband, he used to ride with the Rattlers, years ago before we met. He left that life behind when we married, started fresh." She took a deep breath. "But last month he received a letter from an old friend warning him that Jedediah Crawford, the leader of the Rattlers, was expanding his operations into our area. Smuggling, mostly, using the old ghost towns and mining camps as way stations." Mason nodded, the pieces beginning to align. "And Samuel knew too much about their operations." "Yes," Abigail confirmed. "He threatened to go to the authorities if they brought their business near our home, near our children." Her voice broke slightly. "A week later, they came to our farm. Samuel told me to take the girls and run, that he would hold them off. And you never saw him again, Mason finished quietly. Abigail shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. We've been running ever since, but they keep finding us. It's like they always know where we'll go next. What did Samuel take from them? Mason asked, remembering the note. What do they want back? A ledger, Abigail replied. Samuel kept records of everything from his time with them, names, dates, locations. It was his insurance, he said. As long as he had it, they wouldn't risk coming after him. But they did anyway. Yes, I think there must be something new in it. Something so damaging they can't risk it becoming known. Mason considered this, the implication settling heavily. Do you have this ledger? Abigail hesitated, then nodded toward Grace, still sleeping peacefully. Her doll. Samuel hollowed out the head and placed the pages inside. They've searched our belongings a dozen times and never thought to look there. Mason's respect for her resourcefulness grew. Smart. It won't matter how smart we are if they catch us, Abigail said softly. Crawford doesn't leave witnesses, especially not children. The protective instinct that had been growing in Mason since finding them at the station solidified into iron resolve. They won't catch you, he said firmly. Not while I'm breathing. Abigail studied him, something vulnerable and questioning in her gaze. Why, Mason? Why risk your life for people you just met? The question struck at the heart of what had been driving him since finding them. Why, indeed? Was it simply the decent thing to do, or was there something more, some need for redemption, for a second chance to protect what he had failed to protect before? Before he could answer, Hannah sat up instantly, alert as always. Her eyes moved from her mother to Mason, assessing the situation with that uncanny maturity. They're coming today, aren't they? She asked without preamble. Mason met her gaze directly. Yes, I believe they are. Hannah nodded, as if his confirmation merely validated what she already knew. What do? We prepare, Mason replied, including Abigail in his glance. And we stick together. As the sun rose over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the valley, Mason Tolliver stood at the window of his cabin, watching the approach to his property with the vigilance of a man who had lost everything once and was determined not to lose again. Behind him, Abigail and her daughters prepared for the day, their movements quiet and efficient. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it as a unit, four souls brought together by circumstance and danger, finding in each other a reason to stand against the gathering storm. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against tin plates and Grace's occasional whispered question to her mother. Mason had prepared a simple meal of biscuits and gravy, using the last of his stores. The food was hearty, meant to sustain them through whatever the day might bring. After we eat, Mason said, I want to show you something. He led them outside once the meal was finished, the morning sun warming the chill from the air. Behind the cabin, partially hidden by a stand of cottonwoods, was a small rise. Mason walked up the gentle slope, the others following. At the top stood two wooden crosses, weathered by seasons of sun and rain. Wildflowers grew around the bases, not planted, but volunteered, nature's own memorial. My wife Sarah, Mason said quietly, indicating the larger cross. And my daughter Emma. His hand rested briefly on the smaller marker. 3 years ago, while I was away, our cabin was burned. They didn't make it out. Abigail stood silent, understanding in her eyes. Hannah watched Mason's face with that intense scrutiny that seemed to peer into his very soul. Grace, innocent in her response, knelt to touch one of the wildflowers. Pretty, she said softly, looking up at Mason. Does Emma like flowers? The simple question asked with a child's directness pierced through Mason's carefully constructed armor. Yes, he managed. She loved them, used to make chains of daisies for her hair. Grace nodded solemnly, then placed the small wooden horse she'd found Emma's toy at the base of the smaller cross. So she can play, she explained. Mason swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. That's very kind, Grace. Abigail placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes meeting Mason's over the child's head. There was compassion there, and something more, a recognition of shared pain that created a bridge between them. We've kept our own ghosts from the girls, she said softly. But perhaps that was wrong. Grace understands more than I give her credit for. Children often do, Mason replied. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the breeze ruffling the prairie grass around them. Then Mason straightened his gaze, returning to the practical present. There's a root cellar beneath the cabin, he said. If there's trouble, that's where you'll go. There's a trap door under the rug by the stove. Hannah's eyes widened slightly. Like our house, she said. Pa put us in the cellar when the bad men came. Abigail's face tightened at the memory. Yes, and it saved our lives then. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Mason said. But if it does, you'll be safer below ground. As they walked back to the cabin, Mason found himself studying the girls more closely. Simon's words from his dream echoing in his mind. Look at the girls. What was he missing? Grace skipped ahead, her earlier solemnity forgotten in the bright morning light. Her dark curls bounced with each step, reminding Mason painfully of Emma's blonde ones. Hannah walked more sedately, staying close to her mother, her gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. There was something in the set of Hannah's jaw, the way she carried herself, that nagged at Mason's memory. But whenever he tried to focus on it, the resemblance slipped away like water through his fingers. Inside the cabin, Mason took stock of their supplies. They had food for a few more days, ammunition for both the rifle and the revolver, and water from the well behind the cabin. If the rattlers came in force, they could withstand a short siege, but not a prolonged one. We should move the horses into the barn, he told Abigail. Less chance of them being spotted or stolen. She nodded, practical in her assessment. What else? I want to teach you both to shoot, Mason said. Hannah's old enough, and you'll need to protect Grace if... He let the sentence hang unfinished. If you can't, Abigail completed, her voice steady. Yes, that makes sense. Hannah straightened at the suggestion, eagerness briefly overcoming her usual reserve. Pa was teaching me before he had to go away. Mason nodded. Then we'll continue what he started. They spent the next hour behind the barn where Mason had set up empty cans on a fallen log. He showed Hannah how to hold the revolver, how to sight along the barrel, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Her first shots went wide, but by the fifth try, she hit one of the cans, sending it flying. A small, fierce smile of satisfaction crossed her face. Good, Mason praised. Steady and sure, that's the way. Abigail proved to be a better shot than Mason had expected, hitting the target more often than not. When he commented on her accuracy, she offered a tight smile. Samuel insisted I learn, said a woman alone on the frontier needed to be able to defend herself. Her expression softened. He was a good man, Mason. Whatever his past with the rattlers, he had left it behind. He died trying to give us a chance to escape. Mason nodded, respecting both her grief and her resolve. A man who protects his family is a man worth remembering. Their eyes met over the barrel of the rifle, and for a moment, Mason felt an unexpected connection. Two people who had lost their spouses to violence, who understood the particular weight of that kind of grief. The moment was broken by Grace calling from the porch where she'd been playing with sticks and pebbles. "Riders coming!" Mason whirled, heart pounding but relaxed slightly when he recognized the solitary figure approaching on horseback. Reverend Thompson, his black coat stark against the dusty trail, rode toward the cabin at an unhurried pace. "It's the preacher from town," Mason explained to Abigail, who had tensed beside him. "Reverend Thompson? He must have decided to pay that visit he mentioned yesterday." "Can he be trusted?" Abigail asked, her voice low. Mason considered. "Yes, he's a good man, honorable, but it might be best if you and the girls wait inside while I speak with him." Abigail nodded, gathering Grace and Hannah and ushering them into the cabin. Mason walked out to meet the approaching rider, wondering what had brought the preacher all the way out to his isolated ranch. "Reverend," he greeted as the old man dismounted with the stiffness of age. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." Thompson's weathered face creased in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The Lord's timing rarely aligns with our expectations, Mason." His gaze traveled past Mason to the cabin. "I see you have company." There was no point in denying it. A woman and her 2 daughters. They needed help. "The same woman and children those men in town are seeking, I'd wager." Mason neither confirmed nor denied, which was answer enough. Thompson sighed, his expression troubled. "I feared as much when I saw how you reacted to my news yesterday." The preacher tied his horse to the hitching post. "May I come in? I believe we have matters to discuss that shouldn't be overheard by passing birds or curious coyotes." Mason hesitated, then nodded, leading the way to the cabin. Inside, Abigail stood by the fireplace, her stance protective as she positioned herself between the door and her daughters. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Thompson, recognition flickering across her face. "Mrs. Harlow," Thompson said, removing his hat. "It's been some years." Mason looked between them, surprised. "You know each other. We met once briefly," Abigail replied, her tone cautious. "When Samuel and I were first married, the Reverend performed the ceremony." Thompson nodded. "In Redemption County. Your brother was there. Simon, wasn't it?" "Yes." Abigail confirmed, a shadow crossing her face at the mention of her brother. "Simon Reeves." The name struck Mason like a physical blow. Simon Reeves, the deputy from his dream, the man who had died the same day as Sarah and Emma. It couldn't be coincidence. "Simon Reeves was your brother?" he asked, his voice tight with shock. Abigail's gaze sharpened. "You knew Simon." "He was my deputy in Montana Territory." Mason's mind raced, connections forming like lightning across a night sky. "He died the same day as my family, in a raid on a suspected rattler hideout." The color drained from Abigail's face. "The same day." Thompson looked between them, understanding dawning in his deep-set eyes. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, indeed," he murmured. "It seems your paths were destined to cross long before today." Mason's thoughts whirled. Simon had been investigating the rattlers, had been close to exposing something important. He'd insisted on raiding their hideout that day, drawing Mason away from home. Had he known what would happen? Had he tried to prevent it? "Simon wrote to Samuel," Abigail said slowly, realization spreading across her features. "Last year. He said he had discovered something important about the rattlers, something that connected them to a tragedy in Montana." "My family." Mason said the words like ash in his mouth. "He was trying to tell Samuel about my family." Thompson cleared his throat gently. "I believe it would be wise for all of us to sit down. There is more to this story than meets the eye, and I suspect the Reverend Ezekiel Thompson might have a small part to play in unraveling it." They gathered around the table, Hannah and Grace remaining by the fireplace, sensing the gravity of the adult conversation. Thompson removed a folded paper from his coat pocket, placing it carefully on the table. After our encounter yesterday, Mason and I felt compelled to search through some old correspondence. This letter arrived for you nearly 3 years ago, shortly after you left Montana Territory. I held it for you, but you were unreachable in your grief when you first settled here. Mason stared at the letter, his name written in a familiar hand, Simon's handwriting. "Why bring it now?" he asked, not reaching for it. "Because those men in town bear the mark of the serpent, and they seek a woman with 2 young daughters." Thompson's gaze was steady. "And because the Lord has been laying a burden on my heart about you, Mason Tolliver, for 3 long years." With reluctant fingers, Mason took the letter, breaking the seal that had remained intact all this time. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but legible. "Mason, if you're reading this, I'm likely dead and I'm sorry for it. There's so much I should have told you, but couldn't find the courage to say face to face. The Rattlers are more than just a gang of outlaws. They have connections in high places, judges, marshals, even a territorial governor. What we thought was just smuggling and robbery is the tip of a very dark iceberg. Crawford, their leader, has been eliminating anyone who might expose their operation. I fear you and your family may be targets because of my investigation. By the time you read this, it may already be too late. If so, I bear the weight of that sin. There's one more thing you should know. Hannah is your daughter." Mason's hands shook, the letter trembling in his grasp. "What?" He whispered the word barely audible. "Not by blood, but by law. When your sister-in-law died in childbirth, you and Sarah adopted her infant daughter before you moved west. The adoption papers were filed in my presence. Hannah was just a year old. You'd know her as Hannah Tolliver. If anything happens to me, my sister Abigail will need protection. Find her, Mason. Protect Hannah, your daughter, and her new family. They may be all that's left of both our legacies." With deepest regrets, Simon Reeves Mason looked up from the letter, his vision blurred. Hannah, the serious 7-year-old with the watchful eyes, was the baby he and Sarah had adopted. The child he'd thought had died with his wife in the fire. "I don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "Our Hannah died in the fire, with Sarah." Thompson shook his head. "No, Mason. The child who died was Emma, your birth daughter. Hannah had been sent to stay with Simon's sister with Abigail 2 weeks earlier. Sarah arranged it before the tragedy." "That's impossible," Mason insisted. "I would have known. I would have remembered." "You were consumed by grief," Thompson said gently. "When I tried to tell you Hannah was alive, you couldn't hear it, couldn't process it. You kept insisting both your girls were gone." Mason turned to Abigail, whose face had gone white with shock.
"Did you know?" he demanded. "Did you know who Hannah was?" "No," she whispered, horror and realization mingling in her expression. "Simon brought her to us after Samuel and I lost our first baby. Said she was the orphaned daughter of a distant cousin who'd died in childbirth. We adopted her legally, gave her our name. I never knew, never suspected." Hannah had gone still by the fireplace, her young face a mask of confusion as she sensed the adult's distress. "Mama," she called, her voice small. "What's wrong?" Abigail rose on unsteady legs, going to her daughter. "Nothing's wrong, sweet girl. The grown-ups are just talking about complicated things." But Hannah's gaze had fixed on Mason, something shifting in her expression. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked him directly. Mason couldn't speak. The room seemed to tilt around him, past and present, colliding with dizzying force.
Hannah was his daughter. The baby he and Sarah had taken in had loved as their own. She had survived the fire because she hadn't been there. She had been with Abigail and Samuel, safe from the flames that consumed his home and half his heart. And he hadn't known. For 3 years, he had mourned her alongside Emma, and Sarah, never knowing she lived, breathed, grew. "Mason," Thompson's voice cut through the chaos of his thoughts. "I understand this is a shock, but there is a more immediate concern. The men who seek Abigail and the children, they've been asking specifically about a ledger, one that might contain proof of their crimes, including what happened to your family." The practical reality of their situation dragged Mason back from the brink of emotional collapse. "The ledger in Grace's doll," he said, glancing at Abigail for confirmation. She nodded, still pale but composed. "Samuel believed it contained proof of who ordered the attack on your family. Names, dates, payments." "Crawford," Mason said, the name like poison on his tongue. "Jedediah Crawford." "Yes," Abigail confirmed. "He's behind all of it, the smuggling, the murders, the corruption. And he'll stop at nothing to get that ledger back." Thompson rose from the table, his aged frame somehow straighter, more commanding than before. "Then we must ensure he doesn't succeed. For justice, for Samuel, for Sarah and Emma, and for the living who remain." Mason looked at Hannah again, seeing her with new eyes. The set of her jaw, the determined lift of her chin, they were Sarah's features not by blood, but by example, by the years she had spent in Sarah's loving care before Mason had taken the sheriff's position in Montana. "Hannah," he said softly, the name feeling different on his tongue now. "Would you come here, please?" The girl approached cautiously, her gaze darting between the adults. Mason knelt to her level, seeing in her eyes the wariness of a child who had learned the world could be cruel and unpredictable. "Hannah, do you remember anything about before you lived with Samuel and Abigail?" She frowned, considering. "Sometimes I dream about a lady with yellow hair. She sings to me, and there's a man with a star on his shirt who throws me up in the air and catches me." Her frown deepened. "But Mama says those are just dreams." Mason's heart constricted. Sarah had had blonde hair, and he had worn a sheriff's badge. The dreams were memories, fragments of Hannah's earliest years with them. "Those weren't just dreams," he said gently. "They were memories of your first Mama and Papa." Hannah's eyes widened. "My first Mama, like Grace's doll, has a first head and a second head." Despite everything, Mason felt a smile tug at his lips. "Something like that. Where are they now, my first Mama and Papa?" The question sobered him instantly. "Your first Mama went to heaven. And your first Papa—" He hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Your first Papa thought you had gone to heaven too. But you hadn't. You were safe with your new Mama and Papa." Hannah processed this with the serious consideration she seemed to bring to everything. "Are you my first Papa?" she asked finally, direct as always. Mason nodded, emotion closing his throat. "Yes, Hannah, I am." The girl studied him with those knowing eyes. "That's why you looked at me funny sometimes. You were remembering." "Yes," Mason managed. "I was remembering even though I didn't know what I was remembering." Hannah nodded as if this made perfect sense to her child's logic. Then, with a solemnity that broke what remained of Mason's heart, she reached out and took his hand in her small one. "I'm sorry your little girl died in the fire," she said. "The one in the picture by your bed. She looked nice." "Emma," Mason said, his voice breaking on the name. "Her name was Emma. She was your sister." Hannah's eyes widened at this new revelation. "I had a sister." "Yes, She was a year younger than you. Hannah turned to look at Grace, who was watching the exchange with confused interest. Like Grace is to me, she said. Yes, Mason agreed. Like Grace is to you. The parallel seemed to satisfy something in Hannah. She squeezed Mason's hand once, then released it, returning to her practical nature. Are the snake men still coming? The question jarred Mason back to the present danger. Yes, he said, rising to his feet, and we need to be ready for them. Thompson had been watching the exchange with compassionate eyes. Mason, I came here not just to deliver that letter, but to warn you. Those men in town, they've been joined by others. At least 7 riders, all armed, all wearing expensive guns and hard expressions. Crawford himself. A man matching his description arrived last night, tall with a silver streak in his beard and a scar along his jawline. Mason nodded grimly. That's Crawford. They were planning to ride out at dawn, Thompson continued. Which means they could be here any time now. As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant hoofbeats reached them through the open window. Mason moved to look out his body, tensing at what he saw. Riders, at least 8 of them, approaching across the open ground beyond his property. They were still a mile out, but moving at a determined pace. They're coming, he said, turning back to the room. Thompson, take Abigail and the girls through the back. Your horse is fresh ride for town. Bring back the sheriff. The preacher shook his head. Sheriff Miller is in Crawford's pocket. Has been for years. Why do you think none of the rattlers ever faced justice in these parts? Mason cursed under his breath. Then take them somewhere safe. Your church, perhaps. And leave you to face 8 armed men alone. Thompson's voice hardened with unexpected steel. I may be a man of the cloth, Mason Tolliver, but I was a soldier before I was a preacher. I haven't forgotten how to fight when fighting is what's called for. Abigail stepped forward, her face set with determination. I'm not leaving either. This has been coming for too long. Samuel died trying to protect us from these men. I won't dishonor his sacrifice by running again. Mason looked between them, recognizing the futility of argument. The girls at least should be somewhere safe. The root cellar, Abigail agreed. With Grace's doll and the ledger. Mason nodded. We have maybe 10 minutes before they're within rifle range. Let's make them count. The next few minutes passed in a flurry of activity. Mason positioned Abigail at the window with his rifle, showing her the best angle for cover and clear shots. Thompson, surprisingly spry for his age, helped barricade the door with the heavy table, leaving just enough space for them to retreat inside if necessary. Mason himself took position behind the woodpile near the barn, his revolver loaded and a shotgun propped beside him. From here, he could cover the most likely approach while remaining hidden until the last moment. Hannah helped Grace into the root cellar, making sure her sister had her precious doll, the one containing the evidence that could bring down Crawford and his entire operation. Mason had given Hannah his spare revolver, showing her how to use it only in the gravest extremity. Remember the whistle, he told her. If you hear it, stay hidden. Don't come out until one of us comes for you. Hannah nodded, her expression solemn. I'll protect Grace, she promised. I know you will. Mason touched her cheek briefly. You're brave like your mother, both your mothers. A shadow passed over Hannah's face. The lady with the yellow hair. Yes, Sarah. She would have been so proud of you. Hannah seemed to consider this, then straightened her shoulders with new resolve. I'll be brave for her too, then. As she disappeared into the root cellar, Mason fought back a surge of emotion. How many years had he lost with this child? How much of her growing up had he missed, believing her dead alongside Emma and Sarah? But there was no time for such reflections now. The riders were closing in, dust rising from their horses' hooves as they approached the final stretch of open ground before his property. Mason returned to his position, exchanging a nod with Thompson, who had taken up a position near the cabin's corner. The old preacher held a Winchester rifle with the ease of long familiarity, belying his peaceful profession. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a loose semicircle just beyond effective rifle range. They were a hard-looking bunch, weathered by sun and violence, each man armed with at least one visible weapon. At their center rode a tall figure on a black horse.
Even at this distance, Mason could make out the distinctive silver streak in his dark beard, the scar that pulled at the corner of his mouth. Jedediah Crawford, architect of so much suffering. Crawford raised a hand, and the riders halted. He urged his horse forward a few paces, stopping just within shouting distance. "Tolliver!" he called, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "I know you're there. We have business to discuss." Mason remained silent, watching. Crawford waited, then tried again. "The woman and children you're harboring, they have something that belongs to me. Return it, and we'll ride away peaceful-like." From the cabin, Abigail's voice rang out strong despite the tremor underneath. "It was never yours, Crawford. It belonged to my husband, the man your thugs murdered." Crawford's expression darkened, visible even at this distance. "Mrs. Harlow, I was hoping to settle this without involving you directly. But since you insist—" He gestured to his men. "Burn it! Burn it all!" The riders began to move forward, spreading out to surround the property. Mason tensed his finger, resting lightly on the trigger of his revolver. The moment was coming, the moment when talking would end, and violence would begin. A shot rang out, not from Mason's position, nor from the cabin, but from Thompson's hiding place. The bullet kicked up dust at the hooves of Crawford's horse, causing the animal to rear in alarm. "That's far enough," Thompson called, his voice carrying the authority of his pulpit. "The next one won't miss Crawford." The riders halted, surprised by the unexpected resistance. Crawford fought to control his horse, his face twisted with rage. "Thompson, is that you, old man? Have you finally chosen a side in this world instead of hiding behind your Bible?" "I've always been on the side of righteousness," Thompson replied calmly. "And there's nothing righteous about you or your men, Jedediah Crawford." Crawford laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Righteousness doesn't stop bullets, preacher, and I have 7 men with itchy trigger fingers." 8 against 3, Thompson acknowledged. "Not favorable odds, I grant you, but we have something you don't." "And what's that?" "The truth," Thompson said simply. "About Montana, about Sheriff Tolliver's family, about all of it." Crawford's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before hardening again. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man. I'm here for the ledger Mrs. Harlow stole, nothing more." "The ledger that proves you ordered the murder of Sarah and Emma Tolliver," Mason called out, finally revealing his position. "The ledger that connects you to the corruption of judges and marshals across 3 territories. That ledger, Crawford." Crawford's eyes narrowed as they found Mason recognition, and something like fear flickering in their depths. "Tolliver, I heard you'd given up the badge, turned tail, and run after that tragic fire." "I'm wearing it again today," Mason said, stepping fully into view, his revolver aimed steadily at Crawford's chest. "For my wife, for my daughter, and for Hannah, the daughter you thought died in that fire, but who lived to see this day of reckoning." Confusion crossed Crawford's face. "What are you talking about?" "What daughter?" "Hannah Tolliver," Mason replied. "Adopted daughter of Sarah and Mason Tolliver, sent to stay with her Aunt Abigail 2 weeks before your men burned our home."
The child you've been hunting all this time, not knowing who she really was. Crawford's face drained of color, the implications sinking in. That's impossible. The reports said all three died in the fire. Reports can be wrong, Mason said grimly, especially when there's no one left to identify the bodies properly. But Hannah lived, and now so does the evidence against you. Crawford's composure cracked, rage breaking through. Kill them, and he shouted to his men. Kill them all and burn this place to the ground. The air erupted with gunfire. Mason ducked behind the woodpile as bullets splintered the logs around him. He returned fire, aiming carefully, making each shot count. From the cabin, Abigail's rifle cracked steadily, and Thompson's Winchester spoke with lethal accuracy from his position. 2 of Crawford's men fell in the first exchange, but the others pressed forward, using their horses for cover as they advanced. Mason changed position, moving to the corner of the barn for a better angle. A bullet grazed his arm, burning like a hot poker. He ignored the pain, taking careful aim at a rider trying to circle behind the cabin. His shot caught the man in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. "Thompson," Mason called, "can you cover the north side?" "Already moving," the preacher responded, slipping from his position to a new vantage point. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Shots, movement, more shots. Mason lost track of time, focused only on the next target, the next threat. Crawford had dismounted, taking cover behind a water trough at the edge of the property. His men were more exposed, and they paid for it as Abigail's surprisingly accurate fire dropped another rider. 4 down, 4 to go, including Crawford himself. The odds were evening out. Then Mason heard it, the sound he had been dreading. A high, frightened scream from the direction of the cabin. Grace's voice filled with terror. He risked a glance toward the cabin and saw what had happened. One of Crawford's men had circled around and found the root cellar entrance. He was dragging Grace out by her arm, the child struggling and screaming. Hannah appeared behind them, her small face set with determination. In her hands, she held the revolver Mason had given her, pointing it at the man's back. "Let her go," Hannah demanded, her voice somehow steady, despite the chaos around her. The man turned surprised to find himself confronted by a child with a gun. He laughed a cruel sound. "Well, ain't you a fierce little thing? Put that down before you hurt yourself, girl." Hannah's aim didn't waver. "I said, let her go." Mason was already moving, abandoning his cover to race toward the cabin. He saw the man's expression change as he realized the child might actually shoot. The outlaw released Grace, turning his full attention to Hannah. "Give me that gun, girl," he growled, reaching for her. Hannah pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was enough to startle the man. Before he could recover, Mason was on him, tackling him to the ground with the full force of his body. They struggled in the dust, the outlaw's superior strength nearly overcoming Mason, until Hannah darted forward and kicked the man hard in the head. The momentary distraction gave Mason the opening he needed. He brought the butt of his revolver down on the outlaw's temple, rendering him unconscious. "Hannah Grace, back in the cellar," he ordered, turning to face the ongoing battle. But the girls didn't move. Hannah was staring past Mason, her face white with fear. Mason turned to follow her gaze and found himself looking into the barrel of Jedediah Crawford's revolver. "Touching family reunion." Crawford sneered, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Too bad it has to end so soon." Mason pushed the girls behind him, shielding them with his body. "It's over, Crawford. Half your men are down and the law will be coming." Crawford laughed. "The law. In these parts, I am the law. Sheriff Miller is on my payroll, same as judges and marshals across the territory." "Not all of them," came Thompson's voice from behind Crawford. Some still remember their oaths. Crawford tensed, but didn't turn. Stay back, preacher, or I put a bullet in Tolliver's head right now. You'll be dead before he hits the ground, Thompson replied calmly. I may be old, but my aim is still true. The standoff stretched tension thick in the air. From the cabin, Abigail had emerged, her rifle trained on Crawford as well. They had him surrounded, but he still held the most dangerous position, his gun aimed directly at Mason, with the girls just behind. Seems we're at an impasse, Crawford said, his voice deceptively light. So let's make a deal. The ledger for your lives. Simple as that. And then what? Mason asked. We just trust you to ride away. You don't have much choice, do you? Crawford's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. The ledger. Now. Grace whimpered behind Mason, clinging to her sister. Hannah stood straight, her small shoulders set with the same determination Mason had seen in her since the moment he found her at the abandoned station. It's in my doll, Grace said suddenly, her voice small but clear. The ugly one with the broken eye. Crawford's gaze flicked to the child. Get it, he ordered. Slowly. Grace looked to Mason, who nodded slightly. The little girl turned and walked back to the root cellar entrance, disappearing inside. Moments later, she returned with her rag doll, its mismatched button eyes and patched dress making it appear worthless. Give it to me, Crawford demanded. Grace approached cautiously, holding the doll out. As Crawford reached for it with his free hand, his gun never wavering from Mason's chest, Grace suddenly pulled back. You hurt my papa, she said, her young face solemn. My first papa. Crawford's expression hardened. Your papa got what was coming to him, girl. Now give me the doll. Grace, Abigail said softly, it's all right. Give him what he wants. The little girl hesitated, then thrust the doll into Crawford's hand. He snatched it, a triumphant gleam in his eye. Now, let us go, Mason said. You have what you came for. Crawford smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Not quite everything. His gaze shifted to Hannah. You said this girl is your daughter, the one who was supposed to die in that fire. Mason felt a chill run through him at the calculating look in Crawford's eyes. Leave her out of this. She's just a child. A child who's seen my face, who can identify me. Crawford's smile widened. Can't leave witnesses, Tolliver. You know that. It's why we burned your house in Montana. No witnesses, no testimony. You won't touch her, Mason growled, shifting to keep himself between Crawford and Hannah. Oh, I will, Crawford said calmly. Her, you, the preacher, all of you. But first, he tore the doll's head from its body, revealing the rolled papers stuffed inside. Let me just make sure this is what I came for. It was the opening Mason had been waiting for. As Crawford's attention shifted to the papers, Mason lunged forward, knocking the gun aside. Crawford fired the bullet, tearing through Mason's side instead of his chest. Pain exploded through him, but adrenaline kept him moving. They grappled in the dust, Crawford's superior strength nearly overwhelming Mason's wounded body. The outlaw leader slammed Mason's head against the ground, stars bursting behind his eyes. You should have stayed in Montana, Tolliver, Crawford snarled, his hands closing around Mason's throat. Should have accepted that your family was gone and moved on. Mason struggled, his vision darkening as Crawford's grip tightened. Through the encroaching blackness, he saw Hannah dart forward, snatching up his fallen revolver. But instead of shooting, she grabbed the scattered papers from beside them, backing away quickly. No! Crawford roared, releasing Mason to lunge after her. The reprieve was all Mason needed. He drew the knife from his boot, the one he kept as a last resort, and drove it into Crawford's thigh. The outlaw howled in pain, falling back. Mason rolled away, gasping for breath. Thompson was there suddenly, his Winchester trained on Crawford, preventing the outlaw leader from rising again. "It's over, Jedediah," the preacher said grimly. "The Lord's justice has found you at last." Crawford, clutching his bleeding leg, looked past them to where Hannah stood, with the ledger pages clutched to her chest. His expression contorted with fury and desperation. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "I'm just one man in a very large organization. Kill me, and two more will take my place. The Rattlers can't be stopped by one old preacher, a wounded ex-lawman, and a woman with children." "Perhaps not," came a new voice from the edge of the property. "But they can be stopped by the United States Marshal Service." A group of riders approached, led by a man in a dusty trail coat with a federal marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. Behind him rode at least a dozen armed men, all wearing similar badges. "Marshal James Blackwood," the man introduced himself as he dismounted. "We've been tracking the Rattler organization for over a year. Thanks to some information provided by Reverend Thompson, here we finally have what we need to dismantle it entirely." Crawford's face drained of color. "Thompson, you sold me out to the feds." The preacher smiled thinly. "I've been corresponding with Marshal Blackwood for months, Jedediah, ever since I learned of your connection to the tragedy in Montana. The Lord works through many instruments, and sometimes justice requires patience." Mason, clutching his bleeding side, looked up at Thompson with newfound respect. The old preacher had been playing a deeper game than any of them had realized. Marshal Blackwood approached, nodding to Mason. "Sheriff Tolliver, your reputation precedes you. I'm sorry about what happened to your family in Montana."
"Not all of them died," Mason said, his gaze finding Hannah, who stood protected now in Abigail's embrace. "Some survived to see this day." Blackwood followed his gaze, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The ledger?" he asked, nodding toward the papers Hannah held. "Yes," Mason confirmed. "It contains everything: names, dates, bribes, murders ordered, including the attack on my home that killed my wife and daughter." "And nearly killed your other daughter," Blackwood said, glancing at Hannah, "if not for the fortunate timing of her visit to her aunt." Mason nodded, the full weight of the revelation still settling on him. Hannah was alive. His daughter, not by birth, but by choice, by love, had survived the fire that claimed Sarah and Emma. For 3 years, she had been living with Abigail and Samuel, growing, changing, becoming the serious, brave little girl who now watched him with Sarah's determined expression. Crawford was secured by Blackwood's men, his protests ignored as they bound his hands and treated his leg wound. His remaining men, those who had survived the gunfight, were similarly restrained. "We'll take them to the federal courthouse in Denver," Blackwood explained. "With the evidence in that ledger and witness testimony, Crawford and his entire organization will face justice." Mason nodded, then winced as the movement sent pain lancing through his side. Abigail was beside him immediately, her hands gentle as she examined the wound. "It needs tending," she said, concern in her voice. "You've lost blood." "I've had worse," Mason replied, though in truth the wound throbbed with alarming intensity. Hannah approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on the bloodstain spreading across Mason's shirt. "Are you going to die?" she asked directly, in that way she had of cutting to the heart of matters. Despite the pain, Mason managed a smile. "No, Hannah, not today." The girl nodded, accepting his word as truth. "Good, because I have questions. About before. About the lady with yellow hair." "Sarah," Mason said softly. "Your first mother. And yes, I'll tell you everything I remember.
Every story, every moment. When I'm feeling a bit steadier. Hannah seemed satisfied with this promise. She glanced at Grace, who had moved to stand beside her, confusion still evident in the younger girl's expression. "Grace doesn't understand yet," Hannah said seriously, "about me having two mothers and two fathers. I tried to explain, but it's complicated." "Yes, it is," Mason agreed, "but we'll help her understand. Together." The word hung in the air between them, together. A concept that had seemed impossible just days ago when Mason had believed himself forever alone with his grief. Now, looking at Hannah, at Abigail, and Grace, at Thompson, and the marshals who had come to deliver justice, he felt something he had not experienced in 3 long years: hope. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the yard, where so much blood had been shed, Mason Tolliver allowed himself to be helped into the cabin by Abigail and Thompson. His wound was painful, but not life-threatening, a clean through and through that would heal with time and care. Inside, as Abigail cleaned and bandaged his injury, Mason watched Hannah and Grace sitting by the fire, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. Hannah was explaining something, her small hands moving in expressive gestures, while Grace listened with wide-eyed attention. "She's remarkable," Abigail said softly, following his gaze. "Always has been. So serious, so responsible. Now I understand why. She's your daughter through and through." Mason looked at her, hearing the unspoken question in her words. "She's your daughter too, Abigail. You raised her, loved her, protected her, yet when I couldn't. Nothing changes that." Relief washed over Abigail's features. "I was afraid, with the truth coming out." "The truth is that Hannah has been blessed with 2 mothers and 2 fathers who loved her," Mason said firmly. "Sarah would be grateful knowing you've cared for her all these years." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, Marshal Blackwood and his men were preparing to depart with their prisoners. Crawford, seated on a horse, with his hands bound behind him, glared at the cabin with undisguised hatred. But his power was broken, his organization about to be dismantled by the evidence contained in Samuel's ledger. Thompson stood on the porch, watching the proceedings, with the satisfied expression of a man who had seen a long game finally play out to its conclusion. "You knew," Mason said, joining him despite Abigail's protests, "that he should rest? All this time, you knew Hannah was alive." The preacher nodded. "I tried to tell you those first months after you arrived here, but grief had closed your ears, and later, well, I wasn't certain where Hannah was. Simon's letters mentioned his sister had taken the child, but then the communication stopped. Until recently, when rumors of the Rattlers moving into this territory reached me. And you connected it to Crawford, to what happened in Montana." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Thompson said simply. "When I saw you in town yesterday, buying children's clothes, I knew the time had come for truth to be revealed." Mason leaned against the porch post, his strength ebbing with the fading daylight. "I owe you a debt I can never repay, Reverend." Thompson shook his head. "No debt between friends, Mason, just a request. Name it. Come back to church," the old preacher said, his eyes kind but firm. "Not for my sake, but for yours. For Hannah's. Faith can heal wounds that time alone cannot touch." Hassan considered the request, thinking of the Bible he had abandoned at Sarah and Emma's graves that morning. Was it only that morning? It seemed a lifetime ago. "I'll think on it," he promised. Thompson nodded, satisfied. "That's all I ask." As twilight deepened into dusk, Marshal Blackwood approached the porch, his expression respectful. "We'll be moving out now, Mr. Tolliver. I'll need formal statements from all of you, but that can wait until you've recovered." Mason nodded. What happens now, with Crawford and his men? Justice, Blackwood said simply. For your family, for Samuel Harlow, for all their victims. The ledger names at least a dozen officials who were on Crawford's payroll. We'll be making arrests across 3 territories in the coming weeks. Good, Mason said, the single word carrying the weight of 3 years of grief and anger. As the marshals rode away with their prisoners, Mason turned back to the cabin, drawn by the warm light spilling from its windows. Inside, Abigail was preparing a simple meal, while Hannah and Grace set the table. The domestic scene struck him with unexpected force, a family gathering at day's end, sharing the simple comfort of being together. It wasn't his family, not as it had been with Sarah and Emma. That family was gone forever, buried beneath the wooden crosses on the hillside. But perhaps in time, this could become something new. Something different, but no less precious for the difference. Hannah looked up as he entered, her serious eyes meeting his across the room. In that moment, Mason saw not just the child she was now, but the baby he and Sarah had taken in, had loved as their own. The daughter he had thought lost returned to him through a series of events too unlikely to be mere coincidence. "Are you hungry?" Hannah asked practically. "Mama says you need to eat to get your strength back." "Yes," Mason replied, settling into a chair at the table. "I'm hungry." As Abigail served the simple meal, and Thompson offered a blessing over the food, Mason felt something shift within him, a knot loosening, a weight lifting. The pain of loss would always be there, a shadow on his heart. But alongside it, now grew something he had thought forever beyond his reach. A future. A second chance. A reason to live rather than merely exist. Outside, the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, eternal witnesses to the small dramas of human lives below. On a hill behind the cabin, 2 wooden crosses stood in silent testimony to lives cut short. But in the warm light of the cabin, life continued, changed, but undefeated. And for Mason Tolliver, former sheriff and grieving father, the long night of the soul was finally giving way to the first faint promise of dawn. The days that followed passed in a dreamlike haze for Mason. His wound, though not life-threatening, had weakened him more than he cared to admit. Abigail insisted he rest, tending to him with a gentle efficiency that reminded him painfully of Sarah. He submitted to her care without argument, too overwhelmed by recent revelations to do much else. Hannah became his constant companion during his recovery, sitting beside his bed for hours, asking questions about the past. Her past that he did his best to answer. "Was she pretty, my first mother?" Hannah asked on the 3rd day, perched on a chair beside Mason's bed. "Sarah, yes, she was beautiful," Mason replied, the memory bringing both joy and pain. Blonde hair that caught the sunlight like gold, blue eyes that could see right through a lie, and a smile that could make flowers grow in winter. Hannah considered this with her usual gravity. "And she loved me, even though I wasn't born to her. From the moment she first held you," Mason assured her. "Your birth mother was Sarah's sister Mary. When she died, bringing you into this world, there was never any question that we would raise you as our own. So I was already family." "Yes, but even if you hadn't been, Sarah would have loved you just the same. She had that kind of heart." Hannah nodded, satisfied with this answer. "And Emma, was she nice to me?" Mason smiled, remembering the 2 little girls together. "She adored you, followed you everywhere, trying to do everything just the way her big sister did. You were patient with her most of the time, taught her all sorts of things." A shadow crossed Hannah's face. "I don't remember her very well, just flashes. A little girl with yellow hair like her mama, laughing." That was Emma, Mason said softly, always laughing. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in memories, Mason's vivid and painful, Hannah's fragmented and elusive. Outside, the sound of chopping wood marked Abigail's presence, her strength returning more quickly than Mason's. "Why did the bad men want to hurt us?" Hannah asked suddenly. "Back then, I mean, before Samuel died." Mason hesitated, uncertain how much to tell a 7-year-old about the darkness that had shattered both their families. "There are men in this world who care only for power and money," he said finally, "who will hurt anyone who stands in their way. Like Crawford." "Yes, like Crawford. I was investigating him and his gang for crimes they'd committed. They decided to stop me by taking away what I loved most." Hannah's gaze was unnervingly direct. "But they didn't get all of us. They didn't get me." "No," Mason agreed, his throat tight with emotion. "They didn't get you. And now Crawford is going to face justice for what he did." "Good," Hannah said with surprising vehemence. "He should pay for hurting our family." Our family. The simple phrase struck Mason deeply. Despite the years of separation, despite being raised by Abigail, and Samuel, Hannah still considered herself part of the family. She had been born into the Tolliver family. "He will," Mason promised. "Marshal Blackwood will make sure of it." Hannah nodded, then changed the subject with the quick adaptability of childhood. "Grace wants to know if she can play with Emma's toys, the ones in the trunk. I told her she should ask you." Mason considered the trunk in the corner, the one surviving relic of his life with Sarah and Emma rescued from the ruins of their Montana home. He had brought it with him when he moved here, but had rarely opened it, the memories too painful to face. "Yes," he said finally. "Emma would like that, I think. She never liked to see toys go unloved." Hannah slipped from her chair, mission accomplished. "I'll tell her. And Mason, I think Emma would be glad that Grace has her wooden horse. She takes good care of it." As the child left to find her sister, Mason closed his eyes against a sudden rush of tears. The simple wisdom of children sometimes cut deeper than any adult insight. Yes, Emma would be glad. His sunny, generous daughter would want her toys to bring joy to another child, especially a child who had lost so much as Grace had. The door opened again, and Mason quickly wiped his eyes, expecting Hannah's return. Instead, Abigail entered her arms laden with firewood. "How are you feeling?" she asked, setting the wood beside the stove. "Better," Mason replied. "Strong enough to chop my own wood, I'd wager." Abigail gave him a skeptical look. "Perhaps tomorrow. That wound needs another day at least." She moved about the cabin with easy familiarity, having settled into the role of caretaker with natural grace. In the short time she'd been here, she'd brought order to Mason's Spartan existence, cleaning, cooking, making the small cabin feel like a home again. "Hannah's been asking about Sarah," Mason said, watching her work. "About her life before." Abigail paused, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "That's to be expected. She's trying to piece together her history." She hesitated. "Does it trouble you, her questions?" "No," Mason said honestly. "It helps somehow, keeping Sarah and Emma alive through stories." Abigail nodded, relief evident in the softening of her shoulders. "I've been afraid," she admitted, sitting on the chair Hannah had vacated. "Afraid that now she knows the truth, she'll feel torn. Between us." "Between her families, you mean?" "Yes." Mason considered his words carefully. "Hannah is fortunate in a way few children are. She's been truly loved by two sets of parents. There's no competition in that, Abigail, only abundance." Samuel would have agreed with you, she said softly. He always said love multiplies, rather than divides, when freely given. A wise man. Yes. Abigail's gaze drifted to the window where Hannah and Grace could be seen playing in the yard. What happens now, Mason, when you're healed, when the marshals have completed their investigation? What then? It was the question that had been hovering unspoken between them since the revelation of Hannah's true identity. What did the future hold for this makeshift family thrown together by tragedy and circumstance? I don't know, Mason admitted. I haven't thought beyond making sure Crawford faces justice. We can't stay here indefinitely, Abigail said, practical as always. You've been more than generous, but this cabin is too small for four, and we've imposed on your kindness long enough. It's not an imposition, Mason said quickly, surprised by how strongly he felt about it. And as for the cabin, well, I've been thinking of building an addition, another room or two. The ranch needs a proper house if it's to be a working operation again. Abigail studied him, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're suggesting we stay permanently? I'm suggesting it's an option worth considering, Mason clarified. Hannah is my daughter Abigail. I've lost 3 years with her already. I don't want to lose any more. And what about Grace and me? Where do we fit in this vision of yours? The directness of the question caught Mason off guard. Where indeed, he hadn't thought that far ahead, had only known with certainty that he couldn't bear to be separated from Hannah again. I don't know, he said honestly. But I do know that Hannah loves you both, that separating her from the only mother and sister she clearly remembers would be cruel. Abigail nodded slowly. So we stay the three of us, and you and I, what live as neighbors under the same roof. For Hannah's sake. Put that way, the arrangement sounded awkward, unsustainable. But the alternative, watching Hannah leave with Abigail and Grace, was unthinkable. Perhaps for now, Mason said carefully, until we figure out something better. Abigail rose, her expression unreadable. I should check on the girls. Grace has been having nightmares since the shooting. As she left, Mason felt the conversation's unresolved tension linger in the air. He had no right to ask Abigail to stay to reshape her life around his need to be near Hannah. Yet the thought of any other arrangement filled him with dread. For 3 years he had lived with the belief that his entire family was gone, that he was alone in the world. Now, to discover Hannah alive, only to lose her again to distance and circumstance, it was too much to bear. Mason shifted in the bed, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wound. He needed to be on his feet again, needed to think clearly about the future. About Hannah. About Abigail and Grace, who had become unexpectedly important to him in such a short time. Outside, he could hear the girls' voices, Abigail's occasional gentle instruction. The sounds of family life, so long absent from his existence, now filled his days again. He couldn't lose that. Not again. But what right did he have to ask Abigail to stay? She was a widow with her own grief, her own challenges. Her life had been uprooted by violence and fear. Now that Crawford was captured, she had the freedom to start fresh, anywhere she chose. Anywhere except here on this small ranch, with its painful memories and uncertain future. Mason closed his eyes, exhaustion sweeping over him. The problems would wait. For now, he needed rest. Tomorrow, perhaps the path forward would become clearer. Mason awoke to the sound of horses approaching. He sat up quickly, ignoring the pull of his wound, reaching instinctively for the revolver he kept beside the bed. The cabin was quiet, the pre-dawn light barely illuminating the room. He moved to the window, careful to stay to the side as he peered out. Relief washed through him as he recognized Marshal Blackwood leading a small group of riders. Not danger then, but news. Mason pulled on his shirt and trousers, moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking Abigail and the girls who slept in the loft above. He stepped outside, closing the cabin door softly behind him. "Marshal," he greeted, his voice low. "Early for a social call." Blackwood dismounted, his expression grave. "Not social, I'm afraid. May we speak privately?" Mason nodded, leading the marshal toward the barn, away from the sleeping cabin. "What's happened?" "Crawford escaped during transport to Denver," Blackwood said without preamble. "Killed 2 of my men in the process." Cold dread settled in Mason's stomach. "How?" "Had help waiting along the trail. 3 riders hit us at dawn, freed Crawford and his lieutenant, a man named Harker." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "We got one of the attackers, but Crawford and the others escaped." "And you think he's coming back here?" Mason concluded. It wasn't a question. "I'd stake my badge on it," Blackwood confirmed. "He knows the ledger is evidence that can hang him, and he knows who can testify to its authenticity. Abigail and Hannah. Yes, and you as a former lawman who can connect him to the Montana murders." Mason rubbed a hand across his face, mind racing. "How much time do we have?" "Hard to say. The escape happened yesterday morning, about 50 miles from here. If they're riding hard, they could arrive by midday. If they're being cautious, it might be tomorrow. Either way, not much time to prepare." Mason looked toward the cabin where Abigail and the girls still slept, unaware of the renewed danger. "I need to get them somewhere safe." "That's why I'm here," Blackwood said. "I can escort them to Fort Collins. The Army commander there is a friend untouched by Crawford's corruption. They'd be safe until we recapture him." Mason nodded slowly. It was the sensible course of action. Abigail and the girls would be protected by the full might of the U.S. Army, far from Crawford's reach. Yet something in him rebelled at the thought of separation, of Hannah being taken away so soon after he'd found her again. "What about another option?" he asked. "Thompson's church in Cedar Ridge. It's sturdy, defensible, and Crawford wouldn't expect them to be so close." Blackwood considered. "Possible, but riskier than Fort Collins." "But closer," Mason pointed out. "I could see them regularly, make sure they're safe." The marshal studied him with knowing eyes. "This isn't just about their safety, is it, Tolliver? It's about keeping your daughter near." Mason didn't deny it. "I lost her once, Marshal. I won't lose her again. Not to Crawford, not to distance." Blackwood sighed. "I understand. But consider what's best for her safety, not just your peace of mind." "I am," Mason insisted. "Fort Collins is 5 days' hard ride from here. If something goes wrong, if Crawford somehow tracks them there, I'd be too far away to help." The marshal didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "It's your decision. But if they stay at the church, I'll leave some of my men to bolster security." "Thank you." As they walked back toward the cabin, Mason saw the door open. Abigail stood in the doorway, fully dressed, her expression alert and wary as she took in the marshal and his men. "Trouble?" she asked simply when they approached. "Crawford escaped," Mason confirmed, seeing no point in softening the blow. "Blackwood thinks he'll come back here." Abigail's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "When?" "Soon. Today, perhaps. Tomorrow at the latest." She nodded, absorbing the news with the resilience Mason had come to admire in her. "What do we do?" "You and the girls need to go somewhere safe," Mason said. "I've suggested Thompson's church in Cedar Ridge. Blackwood thinks Fort Collins might be better." "Fort Collins is far," Abigail noted, echoing Mason's earlier concern. "If Crawford is as close as you say..." My men and I will escort you, Blackwood assured her. You'd be under military protection at the fort. Abigail considered her practical nature, weighing the options. And you, Mason, what will you do? Stay here, he said firmly. Crawford will come looking for the ledger and for you. I'll make him believe you're still here, buy you time to reach safety. Alarm flashed across Abigail's face. Alone against Crawford, and however many men he's gathered, that's suicide, Mason. I won't be alone. Blackwood will leave some of his men, and I'll send for Thompson and others I trust from town. It's still too dangerous, Abigail insisted. You're barely recovered from your wound. I've faced worse odds, Mason said, though in truth her concern warmed something long cold within him. Besides, I don't plan to fight them head-on. Just delay them, mislead them. Abigail looked unconvinced, but practical necessity won out. I'll wake the girls, she said. They should eat before we leave. As she turned to go back inside, Blackwood touched Mason's arm. You should go with them, he said quietly. We can set a trap for Crawford elsewhere with less risk to you. Mason shook his head. Crawford's not a fool. If the cabin's abandoned, he'll know something's wrong. He needs to believe they're still here. And if he kills you, what then? What happens to Hannah growing up without her father again? The question struck deep, but Mason's resolve didn't waver. If I don't stop Crawford now, Hannah will never be safe. Neither will Abigail or Grace. He'll hunt them to the ends of the earth. Blackwood held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Your choice. But don't be a hero unnecessarily, Tolliver. That girl needs you alive. The cabin door opened again and Hannah emerged fully dressed, her serious face taking in the scene with her usual penetrating gaze. The bad men are coming back, she said. It wasn't a question. Mason knelt to her level, ignoring the twinge in his side. Yes, but you'll be safe. You and Grace, and your mother are going somewhere they can't find you. Hannah's eyes narrowed. And you're staying here. To fight them. To delay them, Mason corrected. To make sure they don't follow you. I want to stay with you, Hannah said firmly. I can help.
I shot that man before.
No, Hannah, Mason said, matching her seriousness with his own. Your job is to protect Grace, to help your mother keep her safe. That's the most important task right now. The girl considered this, her young face solemn. You promise you won't die. The directness of the question, so typical of Hannah, caught Mason off guard. He couldn't lie to her not about this. I promise I'll do everything in my power to stay alive, he said carefully. To come back to you when it's safe. Hannah studied his face, searching for deception. Finding none, she nodded once, accepting his word. All right, but you have to really try. Not just say you will. I really will try. Mason promised, his throat tight with emotion. With everything in me. Hannah surprised him, then stepping forward to wrap her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. Good, she whispered. Because I just found you. I don't want to lose you again. Harrison held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the small, strong heartbeat against his chest. You won't lose me, Hannah. Not if I have any say in the matter. Over the child's shoulder, he met Abigail's gaze. Something passed between them, an understanding, a shared determination to protect this fierce, serious child who had already endured too much loss in her young life. I'll keep her safe, Abigail said softly, until you come for her. I know you will, Mason replied. And he did know with absolute certainty. Whatever lay between them, this complex, undefined relationship built on shared tragedy and unexpected connection, Abigail's devotion to Hannah was beyond question. As the sun cleared the eastern hills, casting golden light across the valley, preparations for departure began in earnest. Mason helped Abigail gather essentials for herself and the girls, packing them securely on the spare horse. Grace, still sleepy-eyed and confused by the early activity, clung to her doll. The one that had housed the incriminating ledger now emptied of its secret contents. The pages themselves were safely in Marshal Blackwood's possession to be presented as evidence when Crawford was recaptured. "Will you come soon?" Grace asked Mason as he lifted her onto the horse in front of Abigail. "To the church place, as soon as I can," he promised, touched by the child's attachment to him. In the short time they'd been at his ranch, Grace had taken to following him around, asking endless questions, bringing him small treasures. She found a pretty rock, a feather, a wildflower. Her open affection was so different from Hannah's cautious reserve, yet equally precious. "You better," Grace said seriously. "Hannah gets sad when people don't come back." The simple observation struck Mason deeply. Of course, Hannah would fear abandonment. She had lost 2 sets of parents already, first Sarah and Mason, then Samuel. No wonder she approached relationships with such caution, such wariness. "I'll come back," Mason assured both girls, "when it's safe." Hannah mounted on her own pony, a small mare Mason had been training before their arrival, met his gaze steadily. "We'll wait," she said, with the gravity of a much older soul. "However long it takes." Blackwood assigned 4 of his men to escort Abigail and the girls to Cedar Ridge, where Reverend Thompson would be waiting to receive them. The rest would remain with Mason, preparing for Crawford's inevitable arrival. As the small party prepared to depart, Abigail surprised Mason by leaning down from her saddle and taking his hand. "Be careful," she said softly. "Hannah needs her father." The words warmed him unexpectedly. "And what about you, Abigail? What do you need?" Something flickered in her eyes. Vulnerability, perhaps, or a feeling deeper than the cautious friendship they had established. "Peace," she said finally. "Safety for my girls, and perhaps a place to belong again when this is over." Before Mason could respond, she straightened in the saddle, composure returning. "God go with you, Mason Tolliver," she said more formally. "We'll be waiting at the church." With that, she urged her horse forward, Hannah and Grace following close behind the marshals, flanking them protectively. Mason watched them go, a strange mixture of anxiety and determination rising within him. He would not fail them. Not this time. As the riders disappeared over the rise, Blackwood approached, his expression grim. "Now we prepare," he said. "Crawford won't come alone, and he won't come unprepared." Mason nodded, turning back toward the cabin with renewed purpose. "Then neither will we." The hours that followed were filled with careful preparation. Mason and Blackwood's men transformed the small ranch into a defensive position, boarding windows, creating barricades, establishing clear lines of fire from multiple vantage points. "Crawford will expect resistance," Blackwood said as they worked, "but he may not expect us to be so well prepared. That gives us an advantage." Mason wasn't so sure. "Crawford's not a fool. He's evaded justice for years, built an organization that spans 3 territories. He'll be cautious." "Then we'll have to be smarter," Blackwood replied. "Draw him in, make him think he has the upper hand." By midday, the preparations were complete. The ranch appeared peaceful from a distance, but closer inspection would reveal its defenses. Men positioned in the barn behind the woodpile in the root cellar with a clear view of the approach. Mason himself took position in the cabin, which had been subtly transformed. Blankets had been arranged on the bed to suggest sleeping forms. A pot simmered on the stove, giving the impression of a meal being prepared. From outside, smoke curled from the chimney, completing the illusion of ordinary domesticity. As the afternoon waned, tension mounted. Every distant sound brought men to alert every dust cloud on the horizon, narrowed eyes and readied weapons. But no attack came. Darkness fell, bringing with it a new kind of watchfulness. Night attacks were Crawford's specialty, according to Blackwood. The marshals maintained their positions, rotating shifts to ensure fresh eyes kept watch through the long hours. Mason found sleep elusive, his mind filled with images of Hannah, of Abigail, and Grace. Had they reached the church safely? Was Thompson's protection enough if Crawford somehow learned their location? He should have insisted they go to Fort Collins, he thought, in the dark hours before dawn. The Army's protection would have been more certain, more formidable than what a small-town preacher could provide. But the distance, the crushing weight of separation. Mason pushed the thoughts away, forcing himself to focus on the immediate threat. Crawford would come, and when he did, Mason would be ready. Dawn broke clear and cool, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Still no sign of Crawford or his men. The marshals grew restless, Blackwood contemplative. "Perhaps he's more cautious than we thought," the marshal mused. "Or perhaps he's received word of our preparations." Mason frowned. "Or perhaps he's not coming here at all." The thought formed fully in his mind, even as he spoke it aloud, bringing with it a cold wave of dread. What if he's not coming here? What if he learned where Abigail and the girls were taken? Blackwood's expression sharpened. How would he know? Only my men, you and Thompson, were aware of the plan. And Thompson would have had to make preparations at the church. People would have seen him, perhaps overheard something. Mason's anxiety grew with each word. Cedar Ridge is a small-town marshal. Secrets don't keep well in such places. Blackwood considered this, his face grave. "It's possible," he conceded, "but unlikely. Crawford would expect us to move them far away, not keep them so close. Unless he has informants in town," Mason insisted, the dread in his gut intensifying. Remember, he had the local sheriff in his pocket. Who else might be loyal to him? The marshal's expression darkened. "I see your point, but we can't abandon our position here based on a hunch." "Then split your forces," Mason urged. "Leave some men here in case I'm wrong, and take the rest to check on the church." Blackwood hesitated, weighing the tactical implications. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll take 4 men and ride to Cedar Ridge. The rest will remain here with you." "No," Mason said firmly. "I'm coming with you." "Your wound is healing well enough," Mason interrupted. "And if Crawford is at the church, if Hannah and Abigail are in danger, I need to be there." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. We leave immediately." Within minutes, they were mounted and riding hard for Cedar Ridge, leaving 4 marshals behind to maintain the trap at the ranch. Mason pushed his horse to its limits, ignoring the ache in his side where his wound protested the jarring pace. If he was wrong, if his fears were unfounded, they would return to the ranch and resume their vigilance. But if he was right, if Crawford had somehow divined their strategy and gone directly for Abigail and the girls. Mason couldn't complete the thought. The possibility was too horrific to contemplate. Cedar Ridge appeared on the horizon, the church steeple rising above the small cluster of buildings that comprised the town. From this distance, all appeared peaceful. The morning sun glinted off the white-painted church. The streets were beginning to fill with townspeople going about their daily business. Mason and Blackwood slowed their approach, not wanting to alarm the town with a headlong rush of armed riders. They entered at a controlled trot, eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. The church stood at the far end of the main street, its doors closed. windows reflecting the morning light. Nothing seemed amiss yet. The knot of dread in Mason's stomach only tightened as they drew closer. "Something's wrong," he murmured to Blackwood. "It's too quiet." The marshal nodded his experienced eyes, picking up the same subtle wrongness that had alerted Mason. The street near the church was deserted, though elsewhere in town people moved about normally. The church doors, which should have been open for morning prayers, remained firmly shut. They dismounted a short distance away, approaching on foot with weapons drawn, but held low to avoid alarming passers-by. As they neared the church steps, Mason noticed something that turned his blood to ice, a small splash of red on the white-painted wood of the doorframe. Blood. Blackwood saw it too, his expression hardening. He signaled his men to spread out, covering all exits from the building. Then, with a nod to Mason, he approached the door. It swung open at his touch, revealing the dim interior of the church. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews. At first glance, the sanctuary appeared empty. Then Mason saw him. Reverend Thompson slumped in the front pew, his white shirt stained crimson, his head bowed as if in prayer. Mason rushed forward, heart pounding, fearing the worst. But as he reached the old preacher, Thompson's head lifted, his eyes focusing with effort. "Mason," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Thank God." "You're hurt," Mason said, noting the makeshift bandage wrapped around the preacher's shoulder, already soaked through with blood. "What happened? Where are Abigail and the girls?" Thompson's face contorted with pain and regret. "Crawford," he managed. "Came just after dawn. Had men in town already watching. Knew you'd send them here." Cold fury washed through Mason. "Where are they? Where did he take them?" "Don't know for certain," Thompson said, each word an effort. "Heard him say something about the old Garrison mine. Said it was fitting." Mason exchanged a glance with Blackwood. The Garrison mine, abandoned years ago after a collapse, killed a dozen men, lay in the hills 10 miles north of Cedar Ridge. A labyrinth of tunnels and shafts, most unstable, some flooded, a perfect place to hide. Or to eliminate witnesses without leaving evidence.
"How many men with him?"
Blackwood asked, his voice tight with controlled anger.
5, maybe 6,
Thompson replied. "All armed, all dangerous." His hand clutched Mason's sleeve. "Abigail fought like a lioness. One of Crawford's men bears the mark of her fury across his face. But they had too many guns." "And the girls?" Mason asked, dreading the answer. "Took them too. Hannah tried to reach the pistol you gave her, but they were too quick." Thompson's eyes filled with tears. "I failed them, Mason. Failed you." "No," Mason said firmly. "You did everything you could. Now rest. We'll get them back." As Blackwood sent one of his men for the town doctor, Mason moved to the church door, staring in the direction of the distant hills that housed the Garrison mine. Crawford had taken his family, for Hannah was his family, and by extension, so were Abigail and Grace. Taken them to a place of darkness and death, intending God knew what horror. Blackwood joined him, his face grim. "We need a plan, Tolliver. Can't just rush in. The mine is a maze, and Crawford will have the advantage of position." "I know the mine," Mason said, memories surfacing from his early days in the territory. "Worked a claim nearby years ago. There's a back entrance and air shaft the original miners dug to ventilate the deeper tunnels. Most have forgotten it exists." Hope flickered in Blackwood's eyes. "Can you find it again?" "Yes," Mason said with certainty, "and it might just give us the edge we need." The Garrison mine loomed before them, its entrance a dark maw in the hillside, the weathered remnants of support structures jutting from the earth, like the bones of some prehistoric beast. Mason Blackwood and the three remaining marshals lay concealed in the brush, overlooking the site, assessing the situation. Two men guarded the main entrance, rifles resting casually across their laps as they lounged in the shade of an overhanging rock. Horses were tethered nearby, 8 in total, confirming Thompson's estimate of Crawford's strength. "The air shaft is on the other side of the hill," Mason whispered to Blackwood. "About half a mile around. It's narrow, but a man can navigate it if he's careful. And it leads directly into the mine." "To the lower level," Mason confirmed, "where they would have kept their explosives and equipment. If Crawford's holding them anywhere, it would be there. The upper tunnels are too unstable after the collapse." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "So we split up. You take the air shaft, get to Abigail and the girls if you can. My men and I will create a diversion at the main entrance, draw Crawford's attention." "It's risky," Mason acknowledged. "If Crawford panics, if he decides they're more liability than asset." The thought hung between them, too terrible to complete. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Then we make sure he doesn't have time to reach that conclusion," the marshal said grimly. "We go in hard and fast, give him no chance to think, let alone act." Mason nodded, checking his weapons one final time. "I'll need 20 minutes to reach the air shaft and make my way down. Then hit them with everything you've got." 20 minutes, Blackwood agreed. "Not a second more. God go with you, Tolliver." Mason slipped away, circling wide around the mine entrance to avoid detection. The hillside was steep, covered in scrub brush and loose shale that threatened to slide beneath his feet. He moved carefully, mindful of both the treacherous footing and the need for stealth. As he crested the hill, memories flooded back, his brief time as a prospector before taking up the badge. The camaraderie of the mining camp the day the Garrison mine collapsed. Trapped men he'd known and worked alongside. He'd helped with the rescue efforts, had been one of the few who knew about the air shaft and its potential as an escape route. Too late for those men trapped in the deeper tunnels. But perhaps today, that knowledge might save lives rather than merely honor the dead. The air shaft was where he remembered it, a narrow opening in the hillside, partially obscured by brush and fallen rocks. Mason cleared the entrance as quietly as possible, then peered into the darkness below. A rusted ladder clung to one wall of the shaft, descending into shadows. Mason checked the revolver at his hip, the knife in his boot. Then, with a silent prayer for Hannah, for Abigail and Grace, he began his descent into the darkness. The air shaft was narrower than he remembered, the ladder more precarious. Rust flaked beneath his hands, and several rungs gave ominous creaks as they took his weight. The wound in his side protested each movement, a sharp reminder of his recent injury. Mason ignored the pain, focusing only on the descent, on the necessity of silence, on the mental map he held of the mine's layout. The air shaft should connect to the lower tunnel about 300 yards in from the main entrance. From there, he would need to navigate by memory and instinct to find where Crawford was holding his captives. The light from above dwindled as he descended until he was moving in near total darkness. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying the musty scent of earth and old timber. Mason counted the rungs as he climbed down, estimating his depth. 30 feet, 50, 70. At approximately 90 feet, his foot encountered solid ground rather than another rung. He had reached the bottom of the shaft. Pausing, Mason allowed his eyes to adjust to the gloom, faint shapes gradually resolving into the outline of a narrow tunnel extending before him. The lower level of the Garrison mine. He had made it. Mason drew his revolver, holding it ready, as he began to move forward, keeping close to the tunnel wall for guidance in the near darkness. Ahead, he could make out a faint glow light, from lanterns perhaps. or a fire. Crawford and his men making themselves at home in the abandoned mine. And Mason prayed Abigail and the girls still alive, still unharmed. He advanced cautiously, each step measured to avoid dislodging loose stones or creating echoes in the tunnel. The light grew stronger as he approached, and soon he could make out voices, men's voices rough with the easy cruelty of those accustomed to violence. "Just finish it now," one was saying. "No need to drag it out." "Crawford wants to wait," another replied. "Says Tolliver will come for them, and he wants him to see what happens next." Mason's blood ran cold at the casual discussion of murder of his family's murder. He forced himself to remain still, to listen, to gather as much information as possible before acting. "The woman's a fighter." The first voice continued, something like admiration in his tone. "Marked up Harker's face good. He's gonna make her pay for that." "And the kids? What about them?" A pause, then, "Crawford hasn't decided yet. Might keep the little one. She's young enough to forget eventually. The older one, though, she's seen too much. Remembers too much." "Shame," the second voice said without much feeling. "Pretty little thing." Mason's grip tightened on his revolver, rage coursing through him at the casual discussion of Hannah and Grace's fate. These men, these monsters who could contemplate harming children with such indifference. He forced the anger down, channeling it into cold determination. Emotion would make him careless. He needed clarity, precision. The tunnel widened as he approached the light source opening into a larger chamber that had once served as a storage area for mining equipment. Rusty tools still hung on the walls, and the remains of wooden crates littered the floor. In the center of the chamber, a lantern cast its yellow glow over a grim tableau. Abigail sat against one wall, her hands bound before her, a bruise darkening one cheek. Despite this, her posture remained defiant, her gaze steady as she watched the men moving around the chamber. Hannah and Grace were huddled beside her. Grace's face, buried against her mother's side, Hannah sitting straight, her expression a mirror of Abigail's determined defiance. All three appeared unharmed beyond Abigail's bruised face, but the night was young, and Crawford's patience was not known for its endurance. The outlaw leader himself stood near the chamber's entrance, conferring with a man Mason recognized as Harker, his lieutenant. Three other men lounged around the space weapons close at hand, but their posture relaxed, confident in their security. Mason counted quickly. 6 men, including Crawford and Harker. All armed, all dangerous, and between them and their captives no clear line of fire that wouldn't risk hitting Abigail or the girls. He needed a distraction, and soon Blackwood would provide one. Mason checked his pocket watch by the faint light filtering from the chamber. 18 minutes had passed since he left the marshal. The diversion should come any moment now. As if summoned by his thoughts, a distant explosion rocked the mine dust sifting down from the ceiling of the tunnel. The men in the chamber jumped to their feet, hands going to weapons. "What the hell was that?" Harker demanded, looking to Crawford. The outlaw leader's face darkened. "We've got company," he growled. "Tolliver's found us. You two," he pointed to the men nearest the entrance. "Check it out. The rest of you stay alert." As 2 of the outlaws hurried from the chamber toward the main entrance, Mason tensed, ready to move. He needed to time his attack perfectly too soon, and he'd faced too many opponents. Too late, and Crawford might decide to eliminate his hostages rather than risk their rescue. Another explosion sounded closer this time, followed by the distant crack of gunfire. Blackwood and his men were engaging the guards at the entrance, drawing attention away from the chamber. Crawford cursed, his composure slipping. "Harker, take Johnson and secure the main tunnel. I'll stay with our guests." His hand moved to his revolver, eyes fixing on Abigail with cold intent. Time's up, Mrs. Harlow. If I can't have what I want, at least I'll make sure Tolliver has nothing to come back to. Mason's heart froze as Crawford raised his gun, aiming directly at Abigail. Hannah, with the instinctive courage Mason had come to expect from her, threw herself in front of her mother, shielding her with her small body. "No!" Grace cried, her terrified voice echoing in the chamber. Crawford's expression twisted with cruel amusement. "Brave little thing, aren't you? Just like your father, I hear. Well, you can join him in hell." Mason didn't hesitate. He stepped into the chamber, his revolver aimed at Crawford's head. "Lower your weapon," he commanded, his voice deadly calm, "or join your men in the afterlife." Crawford froze, his eyes widening in shock as he realized he'd been outflanked. Harker and Johnson, halfway to the tunnel entrance, spun around, their hands moving to their guns. "Don't," Mason warned them. "I only need one of you alive to stand trial. Doesn't much matter which one." Harker, a tall man with a fresh scratch across his face, Abigail's mark, Mason presumed, sneered. "You're outnumbered, Tolliver. 1 man against 3. Those aren't odds I'd bet on." "I would," Mason replied evenly, "especially when I've got nothing left to lose." His eyes never left Crawford, whose gun remained pointed at Hannah and Abigail. The tableau held for a heartbeat, then another, a deadly balance of wills and weapons. Hannah, still protecting her mother, met Mason's gaze across the chamber. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but absolute trust, faith that he would save them, that he would keep his promise to come back for her. "It's over, Crawford," Mason said, breaking the tense silence. "Your organization is exposed. The ledger is in federal hands. Even if you kill us all, there's nowhere left for you to run." Something flickered in Crawford's eyes, calculation perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt. "I've rebuilt before," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "From less than this." "Not this time," Mason countered. "Too many people know. Too many witnesses. The governors of 3 territories are calling for your head." As he spoke, Mason was aware of movement behind Crawford. Abigail, working at her bonds, her nimble fingers finding weakness in the knots. Hannah had shifted slightly, positioning herself to shield this activity from Crawford's view. "Lower your weapon," Mason repeated. "Face justice like a man, not a coward who hides behind children." Crawford's face contorted with rage. "You dare call me coward? You who couldn't even protect your own family?" The taunt struck deep, but Mason didn't flinch. "I'm protecting them now," he said steadily. "And you're out of options, out of time, and out of men." As if to punctuate his words, another explosion rocked the mine closer than before. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. The battle at the entrance was moving inward, Blackwood and his marshals pressing their advantage. Crawford's resolve visibly wavered. His eyes darted from Mason to the tunnel entrance, calculating his chances. Then, with the suddenness of a cornered predator, he shifted his aim from Abigail to Mason and fired. The bullet grazed Mason's shoulder, tearing through his shirt and drawing blood. But his own shot was true, catching Crawford in the gun arm, sending his weapon clattering to the floor. Harker and Johnson seized the moment to draw their own guns. Mason dropped to one knee, using the cover of a fallen timber as he returned fire. His first shot caught Johnson in the chest, dropping him instantly. His second went wide as Harker dove for cover behind a stack of crates. Crawford, clutching his wounded arm, scrambled for his fallen revolver. Before he could reach it, Abigail, her bonds finally loosened, lunged forward, kicking the weapon away. "You!" Crawford snarled, recognition and hatred mingling in his expression. "Samuel Harlow's widow, the thorn in my side." "And the last face you'll see as a free man," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the danger. Crawford's hand went to his boot, drawing a hidden knife. He lunged at Abigail's blade, flashing in the lantern light. Mason fired again, but the shot went high as Harker, emerging from cover, sent a bullet splintering the timber beside him. Abigail dodged Crawford's attack, years of frontier life having honed her reflexes. But the outlaw leader was relentless, pressing his advantage, forcing her back toward the wall where Grace cowered. Hannah, with the quick thinking that continued to amaze Mason, grabbed a rusted mining tool from the wall and swung it at Crawford's legs. The impromptu weapon connected with his knee, sending him stumbling. Mason, meanwhile, was engaged in a deadly exchange with Harker, each man firing and seeking cover in the confines of the chamber. A bullet tore through Mason's sleeve, another embedded itself in the crate, inches from his head. Then abruptly, the chamber was flooded with new light, as Blackwood and his men arrived through the main tunnel, weapons drawn. "Federal marshals," Blackwood shouted. "Drop your weapons." Harker, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, hesitated for a crucial moment. Mason didn't. His next shot caught the outlaw in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Crawford, recovering from Hannah's attack, saw his lieutenant fall and the marshals advancing. With a curse, he grabbed Grace, pulling the child against him as a shield, his knife at her throat. "Back!" he shouted. "All of you back, or the girl dies." The chamber froze, every weapon trained on Crawford, but no one daring to fire with Grace in the line of fire. The little girl's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down her cheeks as she felt the cold steel against her skin. "Let her go, Crawford," Mason said, rising slowly to his feet. "She's just a child. This is between you and me. And that's why she's valuable," Crawford sneered. "You won't risk her, will you, Tolliver? Not another child's death on your conscience." Mason stepped forward, his revolver lowered but still in his hand. "No, I won't. So take me instead. Let the girl go, and I'll be your hostage." "Mason, no!" Abigail cried, but he silenced her with a look. Crawford considered the offer, his eyes calculating. "Throw down your gun," he demanded. "All of you, weapons on the ground, or I open her throat right here." Mason complied, placing his revolver on the ground. Blackwood and his men hesitated, then followed suit, their faces grim with controlled fury. "That's better," Crawford said, beginning to edge toward the tunnel that led to the airshaft, Mason's entry point, and now, potentially, Crawford's escape route. "Now, Tolliver, you come with me. The rest of you stay right where you are." Mason moved forward, his hands raised to show they were empty. "Let Grace go first," he insisted. "I won't resist once she's safe." Crawford's grip on the child tightened, making her whimper. "You're not in a position to make demands." "I'm trying to help you live through this," Mason countered. "Because if anything happens to that child, there's not a hole deep enough in this mine to hide you from what comes next." Something in Mason's tone, the absolute certainty, the promise of retribution, gave Crawford pause. His eyes darted around the chamber, noting the expressions of Blackwood and his men, of Abigail, and finally of Hannah. The girl stood straight, her gaze fixed on Crawford with an intensity beyond her years. There was no fear in that look, only a cold, clear promise of justice, the same look her father wore. "Fine," Crawford muttered. "The girl for you, but any tricks, and you both die." He loosened his grip on Grace, allowing her to stumble forward. As soon as she was clear, Abigail rushed to her, gathering her into a protective embrace. Mason stepped toward Crawford as promised, but he had no intention of becoming a hostage, of allowing Crawford to escape justice again. As he approached, his hand dropped casually to his side, fingers brushing the handle of the knife concealed in his boot, the same blade that had saved him in his earlier confrontation with Crawford at the ranch. Crawford, his attention divided between Mason and the marshals, didn't notice the subtle movement. When Mason was within arm's reach, the outlaw grabbed him, spinning him around to use as a shield, the knife now at Mason's throat. "Back to the tunnel," Crawford ordered, pushing Mason forward. "Nice and slow." They had taken only 2 steps when Mason made his move. He drove his elbow hard into Crawford's wounded arm, simultaneously grabbing the wrist of the hand that held the knife. Crawford howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Mason to twist free. The 2 men grappled in the dim light of the chamber, Crawford's superior strength nearly overcoming Mason's tactical advantage. The knife flashed between them, seeking flesh, finding only air as they struggled. Then Mason felt it, the solid weight of his own blade still secure in his boot. In one fluid movement, he drew the knife and drove it upward, catching Crawford under the ribs. The outlaw leader gasped, his eyes widening in shock and pain. His own knife clattered to the ground as his hands went to the wound, coming away red with blood. "You!" he managed, disbelief evident in his fading voice. "How?" "For my wife," Mason said quietly. "For my daughter Emma. For everyone you've hurt." Crawford stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. He collapsed against the wall of the chamber, sliding down to sit in the dirt, his life bleeding out between his fingers. Blackwood approached cautiously, his weapon recovered and trained on the fallen outlaw. "It's over, Crawford," he said grimly. "Your reign of terror ends here." Crawford's eyes, already glazing with approaching death, found Mason one last time. "You think this changes anything? Your family still gone?" "Not all of them," Mason replied, turning away from the dying man to where Hannah stood with Abigail and Grace. "Not all of them." As Blackwood's men secured Harker and confirmed Crawford's death, Mason crossed the chamber to his family, for that was what they had become through fire and fear and shared courage. Hannah reached for him first, her small arms wrapping around his waist with surprising strength. "You came," she said simply, "like you promised." "Always," Mason replied, gathering her close, drinking in the miracle of her presence, her safety. "I will always come for you, Hannah." Grace joined the embrace, her tears now those of relief rather than fear. And then hesitantly, Abigail stepped forward, her eyes meeting Mason's over the children's heads. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving us, for saving her." Mason extended his arm, including her in the embrace. "You saved yourselves," he said. "All of you. I just helped a little at the end." As Blackwood organized the removal of Crawford's body and the transportation of the wounded Harker, Mason led his family, his second chance, his redemption from the darkness of the mine into the light of day. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air was clean and sweet after the musty confines of the mine, the open space a blessing after the claustrophobic tunnels. "What happens now?" Abigail asked, as they watched the marshals load the prisoners onto horses for the journey back to Cedar Ridge. Mason looked at her, at Hannah and Grace beside her, and felt a certainty that had been absent from his life for 3 long years. "Now we go home," he said simply, "all of us together." "To your ranch?" Hannah asked, her practical nature reasserting itself. "It's small for 4 people. Mason smiled, the expression feeling natural for the first time in years. "Then we'll build it bigger. Make more room. If," he added, glancing at Abigail, "that's what you want." Abigail met his gaze steadily, something warm and hopeful in her eyes. "Is it what you want, Mason Tolliver?" "More than anything," he replied with simple honesty. The answer seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, decision made. "Then, yes, we'll go home." As they mounted the horses, Blackwood had provided the setting sun at their backs, and the promise of a shared future before them. Mason felt the weight of the past 3 years begin to lift. Sarah and Emma were gone, a loss that would never fully heal. But Hannah was here alive and safe. And with her, Abigail and Grace offering the chance to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. Not a replacement for what had been taken, but a new beginning, a second chance at family, at love, at life itself. As they rode toward Cedar Ridge toward home, Mason glanced back once at the Garrison Mine, where Crawford's reign of terror had ended and his own redemption had begun. Then he turned his face forward toward the future, toward the 3 people who had become against all odds and expectations his family. His oath on the prairie to protect them, to love them, to never again fail those who depended on him would define the rest of his days. A sacred promise made not just to them, but to himself, to Sarah and Emma's memory, and to the God he had doubted but never fully abandoned. Hannah rode beside him, her small face solemn but peaceful, no longer haunted by the shadows of fear and uncertainty. She caught his glance and offered a rare smile, a glimpse of the carefree child she might have been, might yet become. "We're going home," she said, as if testing the words, finding them good. "Yes," Mason agreed, his heart full. "We're going home." And this time he knew he would not be alone when he arrived.